Jerusalem was starving behind its own walls when the officials came to King Zedekiah with a demand. Jeremiah had been telling the soldiers and the people that anyone who remained in the city would die by sword, famine, or disease, while anyone who surrendered to the Babylonians would live. The officials called that message treason. He was weakening the hands of the defenders, they said. He was not seeking the welfare of the people but their harm. Such a man deserved to die. Zedekiah did not defend him. "He is in your hands," the king answered. "The king can do nothing against you." They took Jeremiah into the courtyard of the guard and lowered him by ropes into a cistern belonging to Malchiah, a royal prince. There was no water at the bottom, only mud, and Jeremiah sank into it. Above him, Babylon's army held Jerusalem in its grip. Inside the city, the government had answered the prophet's warning by burying the prophet alive. For decades, Jeremiah had said that Jerusalem would fall if Judah continued on its course. Now the enemy was outside, hunger was inside, and the king still called for him in secret while allowing other men to silence him in public. Jeremiah had no army, no office, and no freedom. Yet the words that had made him hated were becoming the reality everyone else was forced to inhabit. The road to that cistern began more than 40 years earlier, in the days of a very different king. Jeremiah came from Anathoth, a small town in the territory of Benjamin, only a few miles northeast of Jerusalem. He belonged to a priestly family, close enough to the capital for the temple and royal court to shape the life of the region, but outside the city's walls and its centers of authority. His father was Hilkiah, one of the priests at Anathoth. The kingdom into which Jeremiah was born carried a heavy inheritance. Judah had survived the destruction that swept away the northern kingdom of Israel, and Jerusalem had survived an Assyrian invasion in the days of King Hezekiah. But survival had not made the kingdom faithful. Hezekiah's son Manasseh ruled for 55 years and filled Judah with idolatry, violence, and practices condemned by the covenant. According to the royal history, he shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. His son Amon continued in rebellion and was assassinated by his own servants after a reign of only 2 years. Amon's son Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. By the 13th year of Josiah's reign, the young king had begun seeking the God of David and rejecting the idols that had dominated Judah. Assyria, the empire that had controlled the region for generations, was weakening. Its power had not yet disappeared, and no one in Judah could know precisely what political order would replace it. Egypt watched the changing balance. Babylon was rising in the east. Small kingdoms such as Judah lived between great powers whose armies could redraw borders, remove kings, and deport populations. It was in that year that the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. The call did not begin with Jeremiah choosing a public life. It began with a claim over his life that reached back before his birth. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you," the Lord told him. "Before you came out of the womb, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." The scope was immediate and overwhelming. Jeremiah was from a village in Benjamin, but his commission would reach beyond Anathoth and beyond Judah. Kings, kingdoms, and empires would enter the field of his words. The political convulsions of his age would not be treated as accidents of power alone. Jeremiah would be sent to declare what those events meant and what Judah must do while they unfolded. His answer was an objection. "Ah, Lord God, I do not know how to speak, for I am young." Jeremiah did not present himself as prepared for confrontation. He saw his inexperience and the demands of public speech. A prophet sent before rulers, priests, and nations would have to stand where words carried consequences. He would have to accuse men with the power to punish him. He would speak into questions of worship, justice, war, and national survival. Youth was not a small disadvantage for such an assignment. but the answer did not remove the assignment. Do not say, "I am young." You must go to everyone to whom I send you, and whatever I command you, you must speak. Jeremiah's authority would not come from age, rank, or confidence. Neither would he be free to shape the message around what an audience might accept. He was being sent, and the words were being commanded. The same call that denied him the option of retreat also addressed the fear behind his objection. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you. That promise did not mean Jeremiah would avoid danger. The shape of his later life would make that unmistakable. Deliverance would often come after the threat had become real, after arrest, after beating, after confinement, after men had lowered him into the mud. The promise was that his opponents would not be able to end his commission before its work was done. Then the Lord reached out and touched Jeremiah's mouth. "I have put my words in your mouth," he said. "See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant." Those paired actions defined the work ahead. Most of them were acts of removal. Judah had inherited institutions that appeared permanent: a Davidic monarchy, a capital with formidable defenses, a temple identified with the presence of God, and a land bound to the people's covenant memory. Jeremiah would announce that none of these could be used to shelter persistent rebellion. Kings could be removed, walls could be broken, the temple itself could be burned, the population could be uprooted from the land. Yet destruction was not the final verb in his commission. Jeremiah was also appointed to build and to plant. He would live through the loss of nearly everything that seemed to guarantee Judah's future, then speak of restoration when easy optimism had become impossible. The same prophetic word that tore down false confidence would preserve hope beyond judgment. At the beginning, however, Jeremiah was given two visions that fixed his attention on what was approaching. The word of the Lord came to him, "What do you see, Jeremiah?" He answered, "I see the branch of an almond tree." It was an ordinary object, precisely observed. In Hebrew, the name of the almond tree sounded like the word for watching. The vision became a wordplay with force behind it. "You have seen correctly, for I am watching over my word to perform it." Jeremiah's message would often appear powerless after it was spoken. A king could cut a written scroll apart and burn it piece by piece. Priests could denounce him. False prophets could contradict him before the public. Officials could lock him away. Years might pass while Jerusalem continued standing, giving his hearers reason to believe the warning had failed. The almond branch established the opposite. The word was being watched. Delay was not abandonment. Once spoken, it remained active even when those who heard it carried on as though nothing had changed. Then the question came again, "What do you see?" Jeremiah saw a boiling pot tipping toward Judah from the north. The second vision was no quiet branch. Something heated and dangerous was ready to pour across the land. The explanation followed. Disaster would be released from the north against all the inhabitants of Judah. The kingdoms coming under that summons would place their thrones at the entrance of Jerusalem's gates. Their authority would be displayed where Judah's elders and rulers had administered the city. They would come against its walls and against all the towns of the kingdom. The invader was not yet named in Jeremiah's call. During his long ministry, the political world would change until Babylon stood unmistakably at the center of the threat. But from the beginning, the direction was clear. Armies entering Judah from the great powers of Mesopotamia followed the routes of the Fertile Crescent and approached from the north. The boiling pot leaned over the familiar map. The coming disaster also had a stated cause. Judgment would fall because Judah had forsaken the Lord, burned incense to other gods, and bowed before what human hands had made. The crisis ahead would be military and political, but Jeremiah was not permitted to explain it only in those terms. The enemy's advance would expose a collapse already present within Judah's worship and public life. Jeremiah's commission now moved from vision to command. He was told to prepare himself, stand up, and say everything he was commanded to say. He was not to be broken by fear before the people confronting him. His task required full speech. A softened warning would misrepresent the danger. Silence would abandon the responsibility placed upon him. Then came an image of what the Lord would make him, a fortified city, an iron pillar, and bronze walls against the whole land. The language sounded almost impossible when applied to one young man from Anathoth. On the other side stood the kings of Judah, the royal officials, the priests, and the people of the land. Every major source of authority could turn against him. The palace could command. The priests could challenge his standing in sacred matters. Officials could arrest him. The public could join the demand for his death. "They will fight against you," the Lord said. Opposition was built into the call. Jeremiah was not told that clarity would produce acceptance, or that courage would persuade everyone who heard him. The men resisting his words would sometimes believe they were defending the nation. Kings would seek favorable prophecy during war. Priests would protect the temple's status. Officials would treat surrender as betrayal. Crowds would prefer assurances of peace. Jeremiah's message would strike directly at the hopes by which those groups justified their choices. "But they will not prevail against you, for I am with you to deliver you." The promise answered the entire alignment of power. Jeremiah would not become stronger than the monarchy or command more men than the army. He would stand because the word entrusted to him had not yet finished its course. At this early point, Jerusalem had not fallen. Josiah was still on the throne, and his reforms could make renewal seem possible. The temple still dominated the city's worship. The royal house of David still ruled. Assyria's weakening grip might even have looked like an opening for Judah to regain strength and independence. Jeremiah's first visions placed another reality beside that hopeful moment. A pot was already leaning from the north. A word had already been placed in his mouth. The young priest from Anathoth had been appointed to stand before a kingdom that did not yet understand how much could be lost. The Lord was watching over the word to perform it. Jeremiah was sent to Jerusalem with a memory. "I remember the devotion of your youth," the Lord said, "your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness, in a land not sown." The nation's beginning was recalled as a marriage. Israel had been brought out of Egypt and led through a country where survival depended entirely upon God's provision. The people had been holy to the Lord, the first portion of his harvest. Anyone who tried to consume them brought judgment upon himself. That memory made Judah's present conduct harder to excuse. The Lord asked what wrong their ancestors had found in him that caused them to go so far away. They had pursued worthless idols and become worthless themselves. They no longer asked where the God was who had brought them from Egypt, led them through deserts and ravines, and brought them into a fruitful land. The failure reached every level of leadership. The priests did not ask for the Lord. Those responsible for the law did not know him. The shepherds who governed the people rebelled. The prophets spoke in the name of Baal and followed gods unable to help. Jeremiah told them to look beyond Judah's borders, search the western coastlands, send eastward into the desert, ask whether any nation had ever exchanged its gods, even though those gods were not gods at all. Pagan peoples remained loyal to objects with no power, while Judah had abandoned the God who had carried and sustained it. The heavens themselves were summoned to be appalled. The charge could be expressed in two acts. "My people have committed two evils," the Lord said. "They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and dug cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water." Everyone in Judah understood the image. In a dry land, a spring offered running water. A cistern collected what it could and preserved it against drought. To leave a fresh source in order to carve a cracked reservoir was more than disloyal. It was self-destruction. Judah's chosen gods and political protections could not preserve the life entrusted to them. Evidence of that failure was already visible. Judah had become vulnerable to foreign powers. Enemies had roared against the land, and towns had been laid waste. Men from the Egyptian cities of Memphis and Tahpanhes had humiliated the nation. Yet Judah continued moving between Egypt and Assyria, looking to one empire and then another for security. What will you gain by going to Egypt to drink the waters of the Nile? Jeremiah asked. What will you gain by going to Assyria to drink the waters of the Euphrates? This was not a command to ignore military reality. It was an exposure of the belief governing Judah's response to it. The nation had abandoned its covenant and then treated alliances as the cure for the consequences. Its own wickedness would correct it. Its turning away would become its punishment. Judah protested its innocence. The people claimed they had not run after the Baals. Jeremiah directed attention to the places where they worshipped and to the path they had taken. Their pursuit of other gods had become frantic and habitual. They had said to wood, "You are my father," and to stone, "You gave me birth." They turned their backs on the Lord, yet when trouble arrived, they called for him to save them. The answer was cutting. Let the gods they had made arise and save them. Judah possessed as many gods as towns. Even then the people challenged the accusation. They behaved as if they were free of guilt and the Lord's anger had turned away. Jeremiah warned that their insistence upon innocence had itself become part of the case against them. They changed political direction as easily as they had changed objects of worship, and the alliance with Egypt would bring shame just as trust in Assyria had done. During Josiah's reign, the word came to Jeremiah again, this time drawing a comparison between the two Hebrew kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Israel had already been conquered by Assyria. Its people had worshipped at shrines across the land, and exile had followed. Judah had seen the result. That made Judah's responsibility greater. The southern kingdom had watched Israel's unfaithfulness and punishment, yet had not returned with its whole heart. Outward gestures could resemble repentance, while the deeper allegiance remained unchanged. In that sense, faithless Israel appeared less guilty than treacherous Judah. One had rebelled, but the other had witnessed the consequences and continued anyway. Jeremiah was told to proclaim an invitation toward the north, in the direction of the lands where Israelites had been scattered. Return, faithless Israel, I will not look on you in anger, for I am merciful. Return required acknowledgement. They were to recognize that they had rebelled and scattered their worship beneath spreading trees, refusing the Lord's voice. But exile did not have to erase them. God could take them, one from a city and two from a clan, and bring them back to Zion. He could give them shepherds who would lead with knowledge and understanding. The promise reached beyond restoring the old arrangements. Jeremiah spoke of a future in which Jerusalem itself would be called the throne of the Lord. Nations would gather there, and Judah and Israel would come together. The divided people could again possess the land given to their ancestors. But the invitation sharpened the present demand. Judah used the language of relationship, calling God my father and the friend of my youth, while continuing to do every evil it could. Words of intimacy could not substitute for return. The call went out, break up unplowed ground. Do not scatter seed among thorns. Remove the resistance of the heart. Wash evil from within, so that Jerusalem might be saved. Jeremiah began to describe repentance in concrete terms. If Israel returned, put away the detestable idols. If people swore by the living God, let it be in truth, justice, and righteousness. Such a change would affect more than private devotion. The nations could find blessing rather than encountering another community whose worship and conduct contradicted one another. The alternative was an anger compared to fire, burning with no one able to extinguish it. The danger from the north now entered Jeremiah's preaching with greater force. A trumpet was to be sounded in the land. The alarm was to be raised. People in the countryside were told to gather and flee toward fortified cities. A signal should point the way to Zion. Disaster was moving closer. "A lion has gone up from his thicket," Jeremiah declared. "A destroyer of nations has set out." The enemy was described through the effect of its approach. Towns would become ruins. The king would lose heart. Officials would be horrified. Priests would be appalled, and prophets astonished. Those who had assured the people of well-being would face the sword. Jeremiah did not watch this prospect from a safe emotional distance. The coming invasion seized him physically. My anguish," he cried. "I writhe in pain. My heart pounds within me. I cannot remain silent because I have heard the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war." Report followed report. The whole land appeared to be collapsing. Tents were destroyed, curtains torn down, and military standards kept appearing over the horizon. Jeremiah had been commanded to announce the disaster, but announcing it did not make him cold toward those who would suffer. The judgment also exposed a terrible distortion in the people. They were skilled in doing evil, but did not know how to do good. Their intelligence had not disappeared. It had been trained toward destruction. Jeremiah's vision widened until the language resembled creation, collapsing backward. He looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty. He looked toward the heavens, and their light was gone. Mountains quaked. Fertile land became wilderness, and cities lay broken before the Lord's fierce anger. Yet even here, total annihilation was restrained. The land would mourn, but the Lord said he would not make a complete end. Judah would be devastated without being erased. That distinction would eventually matter enormously. At the moment, it offered no protection to a society still refusing to turn. Jerusalem continued trying to make itself desirable to foreign powers. Jeremiah pictured the city dressing in scarlet, putting on gold ornaments, and enlarging its eyes with paint. The effort would fail. The allies it tried to attract would despise it and seek its life. Dependence upon them would end in betrayal. The prophet then walked through the moral case against the city. He was told to move through Jerusalem's streets, search its squares, and see whether he could find one person who acted justly and sought truth. People invoked the Lord's name, but their oaths were false. Jeremiah first considered whether ignorance explained the refusal. Perhaps the poor had acted foolishly because they did not know the Lord's way or the requirements of their God. He would go to the great, the educated and powerful, because they surely knew. But the great had broken the yoke as deliberately as anyone else. Knowledge had increased their responsibility without changing their conduct. From the lowest to the highest, rebellion crossed social rank. Jeremiah described the danger surrounding them as predators around exposed prey. A lion from the forest, a wolf from the desert, a leopard watching their towns. Anyone venturing out could be torn apart. Judah's repeated rebellion had left it unprotected. The people had forsaken the Lord and sworn by gods that were no gods. They had been fed, yet used abundance for betrayal. Men gathered at the houses of prostitutes. Desire ruled them like well-fed stallions. Adultery was not confined to the nation's relationship with God. It had entered human relationships and homes. The Lord asked how such things could go unpunished. An enemy was permitted to climb through Judah's vineyards and destroy, though once again a limit was set. Do not make a complete end. The branches did not belong to the Lord because Israel and Judah had dealt treacherously with him. They denied that he would act. No harm will come upon us, they said. We will not see sword or famine. They dismissed the prophets as wind and treated the word as if it possessed no substance. The response turned their contempt into an image of judgment. Because they called the prophets wind, the word in Jeremiah's mouth would become fire, and the people would become wood. The nation coming against them would be ancient and enduring, speaking a language Judah did not understand. Its warriors would consume harvests, food, sons and daughters, flocks and herds, vines and fig trees. The fortified cities in which Judah trusted would be battered down. When people eventually asked why this had happened, Jeremiah was to give a clear answer. As Judah had forsaken the Lord and served foreign gods in its own land, so it would serve foreigners in a land that was not its own. The punishment would carry the shape of the offense. Judah had chosen foreign masters in worship. It would experience foreign mastery in exile. Still, the people had eyes and did not see, ears and did not hear. They did not fear the one who set the sand as a boundary for the sea, a barrier the waves could strike but not cross. Their hearts had turned away from the order that sustained them. Their rebellion also affected the life of the land. They did not say, "Let us fear the Lord our God, who gives rain in its season and preserves the appointed weeks of harvest." Their wrongdoing had deprived them of good. Within the city, wicked men set traps as bird catchers did. Their houses became full of deception, and through it they grew rich and powerful. They did not defend the cause of the fatherless or secure justice for the poor. Prosperity had concealed corruption, and public success had been purchased at the expense of those least able to resist. The prophets offered falsehood. The priests exercised power through their own arrangements. Most dangerously, the people liked it that way. Deception was not being imposed upon an unwilling public. Leaders and hearers sustained one another. "What will you do when the end comes?" Jeremiah asked. The approaching answer was heard again in the sound of war. People of Benjamin were told to flee from Jerusalem, to blow the trumpet at Tekoa, and raise a signal over Beth Hakkerem. Shepherds with their armies would pitch their tents around the city and assign themselves portions to attack. Jerusalem was warned, as though the besiegers were already giving orders, "Prepare for battle. Rise at noon, rise by night. Destroy her palaces." Violence and destruction filled the city before the foreign army arrived. Oppression flowed continuously. The sickness within Jerusalem and the danger approaching it belonged to the same judgment. The people's ears were closed. The word of the Lord had become offensive to them. They took no pleasure in it. Religious offerings could not repair that refusal. Incense imported from Sheba and sweet cane, brought from distant lands, meant nothing while injustice and disobedience continued. Sacrifice without listening had become another broken cistern. Jeremiah told them to stand at the roads and look. They were to ask for the ancient paths, the good way, and walk in it. There they would find rest. Their answer was simple: "We will not walk in it." Watchmen had been appointed to sound the trumpet. "We will not listen." The disaster then was not arriving without warning. Judah was being shown the path and refusing it in words. What approached from the north would be the consequence of choices repeated until resistance had become the settled posture of the nation. Jeremiah ended the warning with the image of a refiner at a furnace. The bellows blew fiercely. The lead was consumed by the fire. But the refining continued in vain because the wicked were not removed. They would be called rejected silver. The refiner had examined them, and they would not be refined. Yet in the 18th year of Josiah's reign, Judah was given a moment when rejection did not appear to be the only possible outcome. The king ordered repairs to the temple. Money collected from the people had been entrusted to the workmen, and carpenters, builders, and masons were restoring what earlier kings had allowed to decay. Josiah sent his secretary Shaphan to the high priest Hilkiah to oversee the funds and the work. During those repairs, Hilkiah found a book. "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord," he told Shaphan. He gave the scroll to the secretary, who read it. Then Shaphan carried it into the king's presence. He first reported that the money had been delivered to those supervising the work. Only then did he add, "Hilkiah, the priest has given me a book." Shaphan read it aloud before Josiah. When the king heard its words, he tore his clothes. The discovery transformed a building project into a national crisis. The temple was being repaired, but the book revealed that the breach between Judah and its God ran much deeper than damaged stone and neglected timber. The covenant contained commands Judah had violated and consequences it had treated as though they would never arrive. Josiah understood that the anger pronounced there was directed toward his kingdom. "Go and inquire of the Lord for me," he commanded, "and for the people, and for all Judah, concerning the words of this book that has been found. Great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our ancestors have not obeyed the words of this book." The delegation went to Huldah, the prophetess, who lived in Jerusalem. Her answer held together two truths that Judah would have preferred to separate. First, the announced disaster would come. The people had forsaken the Lord and burned incense to other gods, provoking him with what their hands had made. The judgment written in the book was not an empty threat. Jerusalem and its inhabitants would become a desolation and a curse. But Huldah also delivered a personal word to Josiah. He had listened, his heart had been responsive, he had humbled himself, torn his clothes, and wept when he heard what was decreed against the city. Therefore he would be gathered to his grave in peace. His eyes would not see the disaster that would fall upon Jerusalem. The distinction mattered. Josiah's repentance was genuine, and it would change what happened within his own lifetime. But one king's humility could not make decades of bloodshed and idolatry disappear as if they had never occurred. The catastrophe could be delayed. It had not been cancelled. Josiah gathered Judah's elders and went up to the temple. The priests, prophets, and people of Jerusalem joined him, from the least to the greatest. There the king read aloud the words of the covenant book found in the house of the Lord. He stood beside the pillar and pledged himself to follow the Lord, keeping his commands, testimonies, and statutes with all his heart and soul. The people joined the covenant. Then Josiah acted with a thoroughness Judah had not seen from its kings. He ordered the removal of vessels made for Baal, Asherah, and the host of heaven from the temple itself. They were burned outside Jerusalem, and their ashes were carried away. He removed idolatrous priests appointed to burn incense at the high places. He brought out the Asherah image that had stood in the temple, burned it, ground it to dust, and scattered the dust over graves. He tore down the quarters associated with ritual prostitution near the house of the Lord. He brought priests from the towns of Judah and defiled the high places where they had offered incense. He destroyed Topheth in the valley of Ben-Hinnom, so that no one could make a son or daughter pass through fire there. He removed horses dedicated to the sun from the entrance of the temple and burned the chariots of the sun. Altars erected by earlier kings were broken apart. Josiah extended his campaign into the former northern kingdom, where Assyrian control was weakening. At Bethel, he demolished the altar established centuries earlier by Jeroboam, the first king of the divided northern tribes. He burned the high place, crushed it to dust, and destroyed its Asherah. When Josiah saw tombs nearby, he ordered bones taken from them and burned on the altar, defiling it. Then he noticed a monument and asked whose grave it marked. The men of the city told him it belonged to the man of God who had come from Judah and foretold what Josiah had now done to the altar at Bethel. "Leave him alone," the king said. "Let no one move his bones." So they preserved those remains, along with the bones of the prophet from Samaria. Josiah continued through the towns of the north, removing shrines and putting an end to their illicit priesthoods. He also expelled mediums, spiritists, household gods, idols, and other detestable objects found in Judah and Jerusalem. The reform was not a symbolic adjustment at the capital. He attempted to bring the worship of the kingdom into obedience to the covenant that had just been read. Then he commanded the nation to keep the Passover. The festival recalled Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt, the founding rescue behind the covenant Judah had neglected. Josiah provided animals for the people, while his officials and the leaders of the priests and Levites contributed generously. The priests took their places, the Levites organized the sacrifices, and the singers and gatekeepers performed their assigned service. The Passover was kept in Jerusalem, with a scale the royal histories compare to the days of the judges and the kings who followed them. The nation was not only destroying objects of false worship, it was returning to an appointed act of shared remembrance, placing its life again within the story of deliverance and obligation. No king before Josiah had turned to the Lord with the same completeness according to all the law of Moses. No king after him would equal that response. Yet the judgment over Judah remained. The royal account traces it especially to the provocations of Manasseh. The Lord's anger did not turn away from the determination to remove Judah from his presence and reject Jerusalem, the city chosen for his name, along with the temple in which that name had dwelt. This gave Jeremiah's ministry under Josiah a painful tension. The king was tearing down idols, while the prophet continued calling for a return that reached deeper than outward reform. Covenant words were being read in public, but Jeremiah had already exposed a people skilled at speaking faithfully while keeping rebellion within. The reforms were real. So was the resistance they could not, by royal order alone, remove from every heart, household, court, and street. For a time, Josiah's kingdom stood as though an opening had appeared inside the approaching judgment. Assyria's retreat allowed him to extend his influence northward. Worship was reorganized around Jerusalem. The ancient covenant had been heard again. A responsive king occupied David's throne. Then the movement of empires reached Judah. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt marched north toward the Euphrates. Egypt was attempting to intervene in the struggle surrounding the remains of Assyrian power as Babylon pressed westward. To reach the northern battlefield, Necho's forces had to travel through the region along the coastal route. Josiah went out to confront him at Megiddo. According to the chronicler, Necho sent messengers urging Josiah not to interfere. His campaign was not directed against Judah, he said, and God had commanded him to hurry. Josiah did not withdraw. He disguised himself and entered the battle. Archers struck him. "Take me away," he told his servants. "I am badly wounded." They moved him from his war chariot into another chariot and carried him away from Megiddo. Josiah died and was brought to Jerusalem, where he was buried in the tombs of his ancestors. The king, who had been promised that he would not see Jerusalem's disaster, was gone before the greater catastrophe arrived. He had died in battle, yet Hulda's word had held. He was gathered to his grave before the city and temple were destroyed. The peace promised to him was not a prediction that his final day would contain no violence. It meant he would be spared the national ruin reserved for the years after him. Judah mourned. Jeremiah composed laments for Josiah, and singers preserved the mourning as an established practice. The grief belonged not only to the loss of a ruler, but to the sudden closing of his reign's possibility. The king who had heard the covenant, humbled himself, cleansed the land, and called the people to Passover, would not guide Judah through the imperial contest, now overtaking it. The people of the land chose Josiah's son, Jehoahaz, and made him king in Jerusalem. He was 23 years old. He was also called Shallum. His reign lasted only 3 months. The judgment on his rule is brief. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. The energy of Josiah's reform did not become the governing direction of his successor, nor was Jehoiahaz permitted enough time to establish himself securely. Pharaoh Necho, returning from his northern campaign, asserted control over Judah. He summoned or took Jehoiahaz to Riblah in the land of Hamath and removed him from the throne. Riblah lay far north of Jerusalem and served as a strategic headquarters on the routes connecting Syria and the wider region. Judah's king was now being judged by a foreign ruler outside his own kingdom. Necho imposed a heavy payment upon the land, 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. The cost of the imperial struggle would be extracted from Judah's population. Then, the pharaoh selected another son of Josiah, Eliakim, to rule in Jerusalem. Necho changed his name to Jehoiakim, making the renaming itself a mark of control. The people had chosen Jehoiahaz. Egypt chose his replacement. Jehoiakim collected the required silver and gold by taxing the land. Each person was assessed according to wealth so that the tribute demanded by Pharaoh Necho could be paid. Judah still possessed a Davidic king, but its independence had narrowed sharply. The throne now rested under Egyptian authority, funded by money drawn from the people. Jehoiahaz was taken to Egypt. Jeremiah's word concerning him was directed against the instinct to reserve the deepest grief for Josiah. "Do not weep for the dead," he said. "Weep bitterly for the one who goes away, for he will never return or see his native land again." Josiah had been buried with his ancestors in Jerusalem. Jehoiahaz was alive, but exile had cut him away from the land and the throne. He would die in Egypt. The reversal had taken only a few months. Judah moved from a king praised for unparalleled covenant loyalty to a king deposed by a foreign power, carried away and replaced at foreign command. Jeremiah had warned the house of David that royal privilege could not protect rulers who abandoned justice. A king was to defend the poor and needy, rescue the oppressed, and refuse violence against the innocent. Josiah had been remembered as one who did justice and righteousness and defended the cause of the poor. That, Jeremiah said, was what it meant to know the Lord. His sons would be measured by the same standard. Jehoiakim entered power under Egyptian patronage, owing tribute to the empire that had installed him. He inherited a capital still bearing the marks of Josiah's reform and a nation still mourning Josiah's death. He also inherited Jeremiah. The prophet who had spoken during a responsive king's reign would now have to speak before a ruler whose answer to unwelcome words would be very different. Early in Jehoiakim's reign, Jeremiah was commanded to stand in the courtyard of the temple and speak to everyone coming from the towns of Judah to worship. He was to hold back nothing. The setting placed him at the center of national confidence. The temple was where sacrifices were offered, festivals observed, and the covenant remembered. Josiah had recently cleansed it of idolatrous objects and restored its worship. People entering its courts could believe that their presence there proved the relationship between Judah and the Lord remained secure. Jeremiah met them with a condition: if you truly amend your ways and your deeds, if you truly execute justice with one another, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own harm, then I will let you dwell in this place. The temple did not remove the demand for justice. Worship offered inside it could not excuse violence committed beyond its courts. The people's treatment of the vulnerable, their use of power, and their loyalty in worship belonged to the same covenant. But Judah had turned the sanctuary itself into an argument against consequences. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, they said. The repeated phrase treated the building as a guarantee. Jerusalem was the city associated with the house of David. The temple bore the Lord's name. Therefore, many assumed the city could not be abandoned to its enemies. Jeremiah attacked that confidence at its strongest point. Sacred space would not protect people who stole, murdered, committed adultery, swore falsely, burned incense to Baal, and followed other gods, then entered the temple and declared themselves safe. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? A den was where robbers retreated after committing their crimes. Jeremiah accused the worshippers of using the temple in the same way, not as the place where rebellion ended, but as a refuge that allowed it to continue. They came before God after their offenses and treated the sanctuary as permission to go out and do them again. To dismantle their certainty, Jeremiah pointed them to Shiloh. Long before the temple was built in Jerusalem, the tabernacle had stood at Shiloh. It had been an established center of Israel's worship, a place where the Lord caused his name to dwell. Yet Shiloh had not been spared when the people became corrupt. The sanctuary had been lost, the ark captured, and the town reduced from its former standing. Go now to my place that was in Shiloh, Jeremiah said. See what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. The lesson was difficult to evade. Jerusalem's temple could be judged as Shiloh had been judged. The Lord was not dependent upon the building dedicated to him. If Judah persisted, he would cast the temple from his presence and make Jerusalem an object of cursing among the nations. The worshippers could also see the competing loyalties Jeremiah condemned within their own households. Children gathered wood, fathers lit fires, women kneaded dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. Drink offerings were poured out to other gods. Whole families participated, turning idolatry into an ordinary domestic practice. Their sacrifices at the temple could not balance that conduct. When Israel was brought out of Egypt, obedience had been central to the covenant. Obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people. Yet generation after generation had walked according to stubborn hearts. Judah now added its refusal to theirs. Jeremiah was told that the people would not listen when he called, they would not answer when he appealed. The nation possessed the language of faithfulness, while truth had perished from its speech. The consequences were already visible in the valley of Ben Hinnom, south of Jerusalem. At Topheth, people had burned sons and daughters in the fire, an atrocity that Josiah had tried to end by defiling the site. Jeremiah announced that the valley would receive another name, the Valley of Slaughter. So many would die that they would be buried there for lack of space. Bodies would lie exposed to birds and animals. The sounds of celebration, marriage, and ordinary life would cease from the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. The warning struck every form of false assurance at once. Possessing the temple would not preserve them. Performing sacrifices would not preserve them. Claiming the covenant while violating it would not preserve them. Even reforming a site under one king would not preserve the next generation if it returned to the same offenses. Jeremiah then spoke directly against the building around him. If you do not listen to me, to walk in my law that I have set before you, and listen to the words of my servants the prophets, whom I have sent to you persistently, though you have not listened, then I will make this house like Shiloh, and I will make this city a curse for all the nations of the earth. The priests, the prophets, and the people heard him. When Jeremiah finished speaking, they seized him. You must die, they said. His warning was treated as an offense against the temple and the city. To announce that Jerusalem could become desolate sounded to his accusers like an attack upon the nation itself. They demanded to know why he had prophesied in the Lord's name that the temple would become like Shiloh. A crowd gathered around Jeremiah in the temple courts. The confrontation quickly reached the royal government. When Judah's officials heard what had happened, they left the palace and came up to the temple. They took their places at the new gate, where the case could be heard publicly. The priests and prophets presented the charge. This man deserves the sentence of death because he has prophesied against this city, as you have heard with your own ears. Jeremiah did not withdraw the message, soften its terms, or deny that he had spoken it. He answered both the officials and the assembled people. The Lord sent me to prophesy against this house and this city all the words you have heard. Then he repeated the choice contained within the warning. Amend your ways and your deeds, and obey the voice of the Lord your God, and the Lord will relent concerning the disaster he has pronounced against you. The prediction of destruction was not an attempt to make destruction unavoidable. Jeremiah's accusers wanted to kill him for saying the city could fall, while Jeremiah was calling them toward the course by which it might be spared. The severe word was itself an act of warning before the consequence. As for his own life, Jeremiah refused to bargain with a false confession. Here I am in your hands. Do with me as seems good and right to you, but know for certain that if you put me to death, you will bring innocent blood upon yourselves, upon this city, and upon its inhabitants. For in truth the Lord sent me to speak all these words in your hearing. The case now forced the officials to decide more than whether they liked Jeremiah's speech. If he was a genuine prophet, killing him would add the shedding of innocent blood to the very charges already standing against Jerusalem. The officials and the people answered the priests and prophets. This man does not deserve the sentence of death, for he has spoken to us in the name of the Lord our God. Then some of the elders rose and appealed to memory. During the reign of Hezekiah, the prophet Micah of Moresheth had declared that Zion would be plowed like a field, Jerusalem would become a heap of ruins, and the Temple Hill would become a wooded height. Hezekiah had not put Micah to death. He had feared the Lord and sought his favor, and the announced disaster had not fallen in his day. The elders recognized the danger of choosing the opposite response. We are about to bring great disaster upon ourselves, they said. The precedent protected Jeremiah. A prophecy against Jerusalem was not automatically treason or blasphemy. Judah's own remembered history contained a prophet who had spoken similarly, and a faithful king who had answered with humility rather than execution. But the hearing did not prove that prophetic speech was safe under Jehoiachin. Another case from the same reign showed how narrowly Jeremiah had escaped. A man named Uriah, son of Shemaiah, from Kiriath-Jearim, also prophesied in the name of the Lord. His words against Jerusalem and Judah agreed with Jeremiah's warning. King Jehoiachin, his warriors and his officials heard of it, and the king sought to kill him. Uriah became afraid and fled to Egypt. Crossing the border did not put him beyond Jehoiakim's reach. The king sent Elnathan, son of Achbor, and other men after him. They found Uriah in Egypt and brought him back to Jehoiachin. The king had him struck down with the sword. Uriah's body was thrown into the burial place of the common people. His death revealed the character of the court, now ruling Judah. Egypt had installed Jehoiachin, and the king could use those imperial connections to retrieve a prophet who had fled there for refuge. A warning against Jerusalem was answered not by repentance, but by an international pursuit, forced return, execution, and dishonorable burial. Jeremiah had spoken words carrying the same danger. The difference between the two outcomes was not that one message had been acceptable. Jeremiah survived because Ahikam, son of Shaphan, used his influence to prevent him from being handed over to the people and killed. Ahikam belonged to the family at the heart of Josiah's reform. His father, Shaphan, had read the rediscovered law book to the king. Ahikam had been part of the delegation sent to inquire of Huldah. Now, under Josiah's son, he stood between Jeremiah and death. The protection was real, but it did not reconcile the prophet to the government. Jehoiakim's own rule supplied fresh evidence for Jeremiah's accusation. The king was building an expansive palace, paneling upper rooms with cedar and cutting wide windows. Jeremiah confronted the cost hidden beneath that display. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbor serve without pay and does not give him his wages. Jehoiachin appeared determined to rival royal grandeur through cedar, but Jeremiah set his father's example against him. Josiah had eaten and drunk like a king, yet he had also practiced justice and righteousness. He defended the cause of the poor and needy, and it went well with him. "Is not this what it means to know me?" the Lord asked. Jehoiakim's eyes and heart, by contrast, were fixed on dishonest gain, innocent blood, oppression and violence. The problem was not that he occupied a palace. It was that he used royal power for himself while failing the obligations that gave kingship legitimacy. Jeremiah announced a humiliating end for him. The people would not mourn with the customary cries reserved for a brother, a sister, or a fallen ruler. He would receive the burial of a donkey, dragged away and thrown outside Jerusalem's gates. The words now stood against the king as firmly as the temple warning stood against the city. Jehoiakim could see what public prophecy had done. It had brought officials to the temple gate, divided the leadership, preserved Jeremiah, and exposed the execution of Uriah as a choice that might bring further guilt upon Judah. One prophet was dead, another remained under the protection of a powerful family. Neither the priest's accusation nor the king's sword had answered the substance of the warning. Jerusalem continued its worship, and Jehoiakim continued his building. Jeremiah continued speaking. The conflict had moved beyond whether Judah would listen. It was becoming a struggle over whether the word itself could be driven from public life, and what the kingdom would do when the man carrying it could not be silenced. Across the years that followed, Jeremiah carried the dispute into streets, gates, workshops, homes, and fields. His words did not survive as a neat diary of one event after another. They preserve a gathering conflict. Judah resisted the covenant. Jeremiah embodied its warnings, and the cost of speaking entered every part of his life. The Lord sent him through Jerusalem and the towns of Judah with a direct appeal. Listen to the words of this covenant and do them. The covenant was not a relic discovered in the temple and honored by one public ceremony. It required continued obedience. Jeremiah recalled the command given when Israel was brought out of Egypt. "Obey my voice and do all that I command you. So shall you be my people, and I will be your God." But Judah had followed the stubbornness of an evil heart. The people had returned to the sins of earlier generations, serving other gods and breaking the agreement on which their national life rested. Their worship had multiplied until Judah possessed as many gods as towns, and Jerusalem as many altars to shame as streets. The consequence was now fixed enough that Jeremiah was told not to intercede for them. When disaster came, they would cry to the Lord, but their other gods would not save them. Their presence in the temple could not make rebellion holy. Jeremiah had believed himself like a trusting lamb led to slaughter when the Lord showed him what men were planning. The threat did not come only from priests in Jerusalem or officials at court. It reached him in Anathoth, among the people of his own town. They were plotting against his life. "Do not prophesy in the name of the Lord," they warned him, "or you will die by our hand." The prophetic struggle had entered his home ground. Men who knew where he came from wanted the voice from Anathoth extinguished. Jeremiah brought the case before the Lord, asking to see justice against those seeking his death. Judgment was pronounced against them. Their young men would die by the sword, their sons and daughters by famine, and calamity would come upon Anathoth in the appointed year of punishment. Yet Jeremiah's appeal opened into a harder complaint. The Lord was righteous, he said, but he wanted to speak about justice. "Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all who deal treacherously thrive?" His enemies could speak of God while keeping him far from their inner allegiance. Jeremiah had been called to expose such people, but they appeared secure while he faced their plot. He asked that they be drawn out like sheep for slaughter. The answer did not offer him an easier road. If you have raced with men on foot and they have worn you out, how will you compete with horses? Even members of Jeremiah's own family had dealt treacherously with him and joined the outcry. He was warned not to trust their friendly words. The opposition he had experienced was preparation for greater pressure, not its limit. The message itself became something Jeremiah had to enact. He was told to obtain a linen waistband and wear it around his waist without putting it in water. Later, he carried it toward the Euphrates region and hid it in a cleft of rock. After many days, he returned and dug it up. The cloth was ruined and useless. The explanation turned the damaged garment into a picture of Judah. As a waistband clings closely to a person, the Lord had bound Israel and Judah to himself so that they might become his people, his praise, and his honor. But they would not listen. Pride had spoiled the relationship for which they had been chosen. Jeremiah then announced another image everyone understood: jars made to be filled with wine. But these vessels represented kings, priests, prophets, and inhabitants of Jerusalem becoming helpless under judgment. They would collide with one another, parents and children together, and the coming destruction would not be prevented by pity. Give glory to the Lord your God before he brings darkness, Jeremiah urged them. He called Judah to humble itself while there was still time to see the path. Otherwise, the people who expected light would stumble in deepening gloom. If they refused to listen, Jeremiah would weep privately for their pride, because the Lord's flock would be carried away. A drought gave physical form to the nation's condition. The ground cracked because no rain fell. Farmers covered their heads in shame. Deer abandoned newborn fawns because there was no grass. Wild donkeys stood on barren heights, panting for air, their eyes failing for lack of food. At the city gates, people mourned. Servants sent to find water returned with empty jars. Judah's life depended upon rain, and the heavens had withheld it. The people's guilt was great, Jeremiah confessed, yet he pleaded for help for the sake of the Lord's name. O hope of Israel, its Savior in time of trouble, why should you be like a stranger in the land? The answer confronted both the people and those claiming to speak for God. Judah had loved to wander and had not restrained its feet. Jeremiah was again forbidden to pray for its welfare. Fasting would not force acceptance. Sacrifices would not purchase relief. Sword, famine, and disease would consume them. Jeremiah objected that other prophets were assuring the people they would see no sword or famine. They promised lasting peace. Those prophets had not been sent. Their visions were false, their divinations worthless, and their messages products of deception. The very sword and famine they denied would overtake them. Those who trusted their assurances would be thrown into Jerusalem's streets with no one to bury them. Jeremiah mourned over the scene as though it were already before him. Bodies slain in the countryside, people wasted by famine inside the city, prophets and priests wandering without understanding. He asked whether Judah had been rejected completely and pleaded for the covenant to be remembered. But the answer remained severe. Even if Moses and Samuel, two of Israel's greatest intercessors, stood before the Lord, the sentence would not be reversed. The people had crossed a boundary where Jeremiah's prayers could no longer be used to avoid the consequence of continuing rebellion. That left the prophet caught between the suffering he foresaw and the people who blamed him for announcing it. "Woe is me, my mother, that you gave birth to me," he cried, "a man of strife and contention to the whole land." He had neither lent money nor borrowed it, yet everyone cursed him. His conflict was not the result of an ordinary debt or private feud. The words entrusted to him had made him an adversary to people he had not personally wronged. When the words came, Jeremiah said he ate them. They became his joy and the delight of his heart because he bore the Lord's name. Yet that joy did not make his isolation painless. He could not sit among those celebrating. The hand upon him kept him apart, filled with indignation at what he saw. "Why is my pain unceasing?" he asked. "Why is my wound incurable?" the complaint became dangerously direct. Would God prove to him like a deceptive stream, water that failed when it was needed? Jeremiah was called to return from that accusation and speak what was precious rather than what was worthless. He must not turn toward the people merely to escape loneliness. They must turn toward him. The promise from his calling was given again. He would be made a bronze wall. They would fight him, but would not prevail, because the Lord would rescue him from the wicked and violent. His private life was placed under the same message. He was commanded not to marry or have sons and daughters in the land. Children born there, along with their parents, would die under the coming calamities. Jeremiah would proclaim a future in which family continuity itself was ruptured, and his unmarried life became part of that proclamation. He was also forbidden to enter a house of mourning to join the customary grief, because peace, steadfast love, and mercy were being withdrawn from the land. Death would come in such numbers that ordinary burial and mourning could not keep pace. Nor was he to enter a house of feasting and sit down to eat and drink. Within that generation, the sounds of joy, bridegroom and bride would be silenced. Jeremiah stood apart from both funeral and wedding, carrying in his absence the future he announced. Yet judgment was again followed by a horizon beyond it. The ancient deliverance from Egypt would one day be joined by another act of return. People would speak of the Lord, who brought Israel back from the northern land and all the countries where they had been driven. Exile would be real, but it would not own the last generation of the people. For those still in Judah, the immediate issue was written into daily commerce. Jeremiah was told to stand at the people's gate of Jerusalem, where the kings passed, and then at the other gates. He warned rulers and citizens not to carry loads through the gates on the Sabbath or conduct ordinary work on the day set apart for rest. If they listened, Davidic kings would continue entering those gates in chariots and on horses, and Jerusalem would remain inhabited. Worshippers would bring offerings from Judah, Benjamin, the lowlands, the hill country, and the south. If they refused, fire would consume Jerusalem's gates and palaces. The Sabbath command made obedience visible at the threshold of the city. Every load carried through a gate became a choice. The issue was no longer hidden inside a sanctuary or expressed only in national policy. Merchants, officials, workers, and kings could demonstrate whether covenant commands governed ordinary life. Jeremiah was then sent to a potter's house. He watched the craftsman working at his wheel. When the vessel became spoiled in the potter's hand, the potter reshaped the same clay into another vessel, as seemed right to him. The image declared God's authority over nations and kingdoms. If a nation threatened with destruction turned from evil, the announced disaster could be withheld. If a nation promised blessing turned toward evil, the promised good could be reconsidered. Prophecy was not a mechanical fate detached from human response. The warning created a moment of responsibility. Jeremiah applied it to Judah. Disaster was being shaped against them, so each person should turn from an evil way and amend both conduct and action. Their answer was blunt. It is hopeless. We will follow our own plans, and each of us will act according to the stubbornness of his evil heart. They called change impossible, while choosing not to change. The refusal turned the potter's freedom into a threat. Judah would be scattered before its enemies. The opposition answered with a plan of its own. "Come, let us make plots against Jeremiah," they said. Priestly instruction, wise counsel, and prophetic words would continue without him. "Come, let us strike him with the tongue, and let us pay no attention to any of his words." Jeremiah responded with another enacted warning. He purchased an earthenware flask and took elders from the people and priests outside the potsherd gate into the valley of Ben Hinnom. There, near the place stained by innocent blood and child sacrifice, he announced disaster upon Jerusalem. Then he smashed the flask before them. The city would be broken as that vessel had been broken, so completely that it could not be repaired. Topheth would become a burial ground until no room remained, and Jerusalem would be made unclean like the valley where its people had worshipped the host of heaven and poured offerings to other gods. Jeremiah returned from Tophet and stood in the temple court, bringing the sign back into the center of public worship. Pasha, son of Immer, the priest serving as chief officer of the temple, heard him. He struck Jeremiah and placed him in stocks at the upper Benjamin gate of the temple. The next day, Pasha released him. Jeremiah answered by giving him a new name, Terror on Every Side. Pasha would become a terror to himself and his friends. He would watch them fall to Babylon's sword. Judah's wealth, royal treasures, and population would be handed over, and Pasha himself would go into exile and die there with those to whom he had prophesied falsely. When the confrontation ended, Jeremiah's composure broke open before God. "You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived," he said. "You overpowered me and prevailed." Whenever he spoke, he had to cry out violence and destruction. The word had brought him reproach and mockery all day long. He tried to resolve that he would no longer mention the Lord or speak in his name, but silence became impossible. The word was like a fire shut inside his bones. Jeremiah grew weary from holding it in and could not contain it. He heard whispering all around, terror on every side, as people watched for him to stumble. Even companions waited for a chance to prevail against him and take revenge. Then confidence returned. The Lord was with him like a formidable warrior. His persecutors would stumble. Jeremiah called for praise because the life of the needy had been rescued from evildoers. But the relief did not hold. He cursed the day of his birth and the man who had announced it to his father. He wished the day had disappeared, asking why he had come from the womb to see trouble and sorrow and end his days in shame. Jeremiah had become the sign he could not put down, isolated from celebration, threatened at home, beaten at the temple, unable to stop speaking, and unable to escape the grief of what he spoke. And beyond Judah, the nations were moving toward the hour when the fire in his bones would acquire the name of an empire. In the 4th year of Jehoiachin, the struggle among the great powers reached a decisive battlefield. Pharaoh Necho's army had established itself at Carchemish, a fortified city on the Euphrates. Egypt was trying to preserve its influence in Syria and the lands to the south, where Judah had already become its tributary. Against it came the forces of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. The Egyptian army went into battle with shields prepared and horses harnessed. Its hired soldiers included warriors from Cush, Put, and Lud. The picture preserved in Jeremiah's oracle is one of a vast, equipped force advancing with confidence. Then its order broke. "Why do I see them terrified?" Jeremiah declared. "They are retreating. Their warriors are defeated. Panic closed every direction. The swift could not flee fast enough, and the strong could not escape. Egypt had risen like the Nile in flood, boasting that it would cover the earth, destroy cities, and overwhelm their inhabitants. At Carchemish, that flood was stopped. Egypt's forces fell in the north beside the Euphrates. Nebuchadnezzar defeated them. The outcome altered the political world around Judah. Assyria's dominion had already collapsed. Egypt had tried to fill the space and had placed Jehoiachin on Jerusalem's throne. Now Babylon stood as the dominant power, pressing into the west. The danger Jeremiah had long announced from the north was no longer an unnamed invader at the edge of vision. It had an army, a commander, and a victory that every small kingdom in the region would have to reckon with. In that same year, Jeremiah addressed all the people of Judah and Jerusalem. He marked the time with painful precision. From the 13th year of Josiah until that day, for 23 years, the word of the Lord had come to him. "I have spoken to you again and again," he said, "but you have not listened." Nor had Jeremiah stood alone. Other prophets had called the people to turn from their evil ways, abandon the gods they had made, and remain in the land given to their ancestors. Judah had answered sustained warning with sustained refusal. The years themselves had now become evidence. Jeremiah's message had passed through the hopeful reforms of Josiah, through the king's death, through the removal of Jehoahaz, and into Jehoiakim's Egyptian-backed reign. Different conditions had produced the same response. The people had not listened. Therefore the northern peoples would be summoned, and Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon would be brought against Judah, its inhabitants, and the surrounding nations. Jeremiah described the Babylonian king as the Lord's servant, not because Babylon worshipped Israel's God or acted from righteous motives, but because its power would perform a judgment already declared. The consequences would strike at the sounds by which people recognized settled life. The voice of bridegroom and bride would cease. The grinding of millstones would stop. The light of lamps would disappear. A land once filled with homes, labor, marriages, and celebration would become desolate. Judah and the neighboring nations would serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. The number denied every promise of a quick political recovery. Babylon's domination would outlast the plans of rulers who expected alliances, rebellion, or the next change of empire to restore normal life. Many of those hearing Jeremiah would not live to see its end, but Babylon's service in judgment did not make Babylon innocent or eternal. When the appointed period was completed, the empire and the land of the Chaldeans would be punished for their own guilt. The conqueror would itself become conquered. The power used against nations would face the measure of its own violence. Jeremiah's vision then took the form of a cup. "Take from my hand this cup of the wine of wrath," the Lord told him, "and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it." The cup passed first to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah, to their kings and officials. Judgment began with the people who possessed the covenant and the temple and had refused the word sent to them. But it did not stop at Judah's border. Egypt and its rulers would drink. So would the mixed peoples associated with it, the land of Uz and the Philistine cities of Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and what remained of Ashdod. Edom, Moab, and Ammon were named. Tyre and Sidon, the coastlands beyond the sea, Dedan, Tamar, Buz, the desert tribes, Arabia, Zimri, Elam, Media, and the kingdoms of the north all entered the proclamation. At last, the king of Babylon himself would drink. The order formed a widening circle. Nations that feared Babylon, nations that hoped to profit from Judah's fall, and Babylon itself all stood beneath judgment. No empire could claim the right to violence simply because it had been permitted to prevail for a time. If any nation refused the cup, Jeremiah was to tell it that refusal would not exempt it. Will you go unpunished? You will not go unpunished. The disaster was pictured as a storm moving from nation to nation. The Lord would roar from on high against his own pasture, then bring a charge against all peoples. The slain would lie from one end of the earth to the other. Shepherds, the rulers responsible for their peoples, would find no way to flee. Their kingdoms would be shattered like fine pottery. Jeremiah's collected words against the nations gave distinct form to that wider reckoning. Egypt, though defeated at Carchemish, remained a power whose shadow lay over Judah. Its wealth, army, and ancient prestige continued to invite confidence. Jeremiah announced that the northern conqueror would enter Egypt itself. The cities of Migdol, Memphis, and Tahpanhes were warned to prepare. Egypt was compared to a beautiful heifer tormented by an attacker from the north. Its mercenaries, like fattened calves, would turn and flee together when the day of calamity arrived. The oracle did not end with Egypt's permanent extinction. After judgment, Egypt would again be inhabited as in former days. But restoration after defeat was very different from the illusion that defeat could never come. The same restraint appeared in the word concerning Jacob. Israel was told not to fear, as though exile meant annihilation. The people would be saved from distant lands and their descendants from captivity. Yet, they would not be left altogether uncorrected. The promise of survival did not erase the justice of what was approaching. To the west, the Philistine cities faced their own devastation. Waters were rising from the north like an overflowing torrent, covering the land and everything in it. Fathers would be unable to turn back for their children because their hands had gone weak. Gaza would shave its head in mourning. Ashkelon would be silenced. The sword was addressed as though it possessed a will. How long until you rest? Return to your sheath. But the answer gave it no rest while its appointed work remained. Moab received a longer accusation. Its people had trusted in their achievements and treasures. Their god Chemosh, along with priests and officials, would go into exile. Town after town was named as ruin moved through the land. Moab has been at ease from youth, Jeremiah said, using the image of wine left undisturbed on its sediment. It had not been poured from vessel to vessel or carried into exile, so its taste remained and its scent had not changed. That long security had shaped the nation's pride. Now pourers would come. They would empty the vessel and smash the jars. Moab would be ashamed of Chemosh, just as the northern kingdom of Israel had been ashamed of the calf sanctuary at Bethel in which it trusted. The nation's arrogance was described relentlessly: pride, loftiness, insolence, boasting. Jeremiah announced judgment on the worship centers and the ruler whose power Moab revered. Yet he also lamented the ruin. His heart mourned for Moab like a flute. Judgment against a hostile nation was not presented as a spectacle requiring no grief. And once again, destruction was not the final line. In days to come, Moab's fortunes would be restored. The Ammonites had occupied territory associated with the tribe of Gad after the northern kingdom's removal. Jeremiah challenged their claim, as though Israel had no heirs. Their god Milcom would go into exile with priests and officials. Rabbah, the Ammonite capital, would become a desolate mound. Yet Ammon, too, received a promise that its fortunes would later be restored. Edom trusted its reputation for wisdom and the strength of its mountain settlements. Those living among the rocks believed their height gave security, as though they nested with the eagle. Jeremiah announced that they would be brought down. Teman and Bozrah would be overwhelmed. The fall would be so severe that travelers would recoil at the sight. Damascus and the Syrian cities heard reports that made them melt with fear. The famous city would become helpless, and fire would consume the defenses associated with its king. Kedar and the desert kingdoms ruled by Hazor were warned that Nebuchadnezzar would strike them. Their tents, flocks, curtains, vessels, and camels would be taken. The people who lived at ease and considered themselves secure would scatter in every direction. An oracle from the beginning of Zedekiah's reign would later address Elam in the east. Its bow, the source of its military strength, would be broken. Its people would be scattered toward every wind. Yet Elam also received a distant promise of restoration. The collected prophecies did not flatten the nations into one faceless enemy. Each possessed its confidence, its guilt, its fear, and a future determined neither by pride nor by military power alone. For Judah in Jehoiakim's fourth year, however, the urgent fact was Babylon's ascent. The 70 years had been announced. The cup had been placed before Jerusalem. Carchemish had shown how quickly a force that looked like a flood could be driven back. That same year also exposed the human cost of preserving Jeremiah's words. Baruch, son of Neriah, served as Jeremiah's scribe. He had begun writing the prophet's words as Jeremiah dictated them. The work placed Baruch inside the conflict rather than safely beside it. Recording the message associated him with a man already threatened, beaten, and publicly opposed. Baruch became overwhelmed. "Woe is me," he said, "for the Lord has added sorrow to my pain. I am weary with my groaning, and I find no rest." His complaint drew a personal answer, but not the answer of ease. The Lord was tearing down what he had built and uprooting what he had planted throughout the land. Baruch had attached himself to a prophetic mission whose central verbs were becoming national experience. He could not expect private advancement while the kingdom around him was being dismantled. Do you seek great things for yourself? Do not seek them. The rebuke was followed by a promise measured to the age in which he lived. Disaster would come upon all flesh, but Baruch would receive his life as a prize of war wherever he went. He was not promised position, safety in Jerusalem, or freedom from fear. He was promised survival. The scribe would live to carry words that kings tried to suppress, and refugees would carry across borders. For now, he sat with Jeremiah's dictation before him, while Babylon's victory changed the world beyond the page. Jehoiachin still ruled in Jerusalem. Egypt's appointee now faced Egypt's conqueror, and the written word in Baruch's hands was about to enter the king's palace. Jeremiah dictated because he had been barred from entering the temple. The restriction did not silence the message. It changed the person who would carry it into public. Take a scroll, the Lord told him, and write on it all the words I have spoken to you concerning Israel, Judah, and all the nations, from the day I first spoke to you in the reign of Josiah until today. The command gathered more than 20 years of warning into a form that could be read, copied, preserved, and carried where Jeremiah himself could not go. The words, spoken in different places and circumstances, would now stand together. Their accumulation might show Judah what isolated confrontations had not. Perhaps, the Lord said, when the house of Judah hears all the disaster I intend to bring upon them, each of them may turn from his evil way, so that I may forgive their guilt and their sin. Even at this stage, the purpose of the scroll was not simply to leave a record proving that destruction had been predicted. It was placed before the people as another opportunity to turn. Jeremiah summoned Baruch. The scribe wrote on the scroll as the prophet dictated every word given to him. Then Jeremiah assigned him the public task. I am barred from going to the house of the Lord. So you go, and on a day of fasting read from the scroll the words you have written at my dictation. Read them in the hearing of all the people in the temple, and also in the hearing of those who come from the towns of Judah. A fast would bring a large audience into Jerusalem and create a setting in which the people publicly acknowledged crisis and sought divine help. Jeremiah had already warned that fasting without obedience could not avert judgment. Now the gathered worshippers would hear why their national distress had become so severe. Perhaps they will present their petition before the Lord, Jeremiah said, and each will turn from his evil way, for great are the anger and wrath pronounced against this people. Baruch did as he was commanded. The opportunity came in the 9th month of Jehoiakim's 5th year. A fast before the Lord had been proclaimed for the people of Jerusalem and for those arriving from the towns of Judah. It was the cold season, nearly a year after the command to prepare the scroll. Baruch entered the temple carrying Jeremiah's words. He went to the chamber of Gemariah, son of Shaphan, a royal secretary from the same influential family that had helped preserve Jeremiah's life. The chamber stood in the upper courtyard near the new gate of the temple, giving Baruch a place from which the gathered people could hear him. There he read the scroll aloud. The warnings once delivered through Jeremiah's living voice now sounded through Baruch's. Worshippers heard the long case against Judah. The abandoned covenant, corrupt worship, injustice, refusal, approaching invasion and judgment upon the city. The scroll joined the years into one sustained appeal. Whatever changes had come in kings, alliances, and public ceremonies, the central demand had remained unanswered. Among those who heard was Micaiah, Gemariah's son. He left the temple and went down to the royal palace, entering the secretary's chamber. The king's officials were assembled there: Elishama, the secretary, Delaiah, son of Shemaiah, Elnathan, son of Achbor, Gemariah son of Shaphan, Zedekiah son of Hananiah, and others. Micaiah reported everything he had heard Baruch read. The officials responded immediately. They sent Jehudi to the temple with instructions for Baruch to bring the scroll and come before them. Baruch arrived holding it in his hand. "Sit down," they told him, "and read it to us." So Baruch read Jeremiah's words a second time, now before men who served within the royal administration. Their reaction differed sharply from the response Jeremiah had received from priests and false prophets in the temple courtyard. When they heard the contents, they looked at one another in fear. These men understood enough of Judah's political situation and enough of the history behind the warnings to recognize the danger. "We must report all these words to the king," they said. Before doing so, they questioned Baruch. "Tell us, how did you write all these words? Was it at Jeremiah's dictation?" Baruch answered plainly. Jeremiah had spoken every word aloud, and Baruch had written them in ink on the scroll. The officials now knew that the document was not Baruch's independent composition or a collection circulating without an accountable source. It was Jeremiah's dictated message, set down by a recognized scribe. The chain was direct. Their next instruction showed how seriously they regarded the king's likely response. "You and Jeremiah must go and hide. Do not let anyone know where you are." They kept the scroll and placed it in the chamber of Elishama, the secretary. Then they entered the royal court and reported its contents to Jehoiakim. The king ordered Jehudi to retrieve it. Jehoiakim was sitting in his winter apartment. A fire burned in the brazier before him, and officials stood around him. Jehudi began reading the scroll aloud. The scene placed the written word within reach of the man it accused. Jehoiakim heard the history of ignored warnings and the announcement that Babylon would bring destruction. He heard that royal power, temple worship, and political maneuvering could not preserve a kingdom refusing justice and obedience. He heard words dictated by the prophet, whose public ministry his court had already tried to suppress. After Jehudi read 3 or 4 columns, the king took a scribe's knife, cut that portion from the scroll, and threw it into the fire. Then the reading continued. 3 or 4 more columns were heard. Jehoiakim cut them away and burned them. Section by section, the scroll passed from Jehudi's hand to the knife, and from the knife into the flames, until the entire document was consumed. The king's action was deliberate and sustained. This was no sudden destruction committed before he understood what he held. He repeatedly listened, cut, and burned. Each portion gave him another opportunity to stop. Each portion met the same answer. The men around him did not tear their clothes. Neither the king nor most of his attendants showed the fear that had seized the officials during Baruch's reading. The gesture that had marked Josiah's response to the covenant book was absent from his son. That contrast defined the 2 reigns. Josiah heard a scroll announce judgment, tore his garments, sought prophetic counsel, and acted to reform the nation. Jehoiakim heard a scroll announce judgment, cut the scroll, and fed it to the fire. 3 officials did object. Elnathan, Delaiah, and Gemariah urged the king not to burn it. He refused them. Elnathan's presence made the moment especially revealing. He had been sent to Egypt to seize Uriah and bring him back to execution. Now even he opposed destroying Jeremiah's scroll. Whatever his earlier part in the court's violence, he understood that burning this document was a step the king should not take. Jehoiakim proceeded anyway. Then he ordered the arrest of Baruch and Jeremiah. He sent Jeremiel, a royal son, together with Seraiah son of Azriel and Shelemiah son of Abdeel, to seize them. But they could not be found. The Lord had hidden them. The king had destroyed the visible scroll and sent officers after the men who produced it. For the moment, it could appear that he had succeeded. The document had become ash. Jeremiah was unable to stand openly in the temple. Baruch had been forced into hiding. The palace remained under Jehoiakim's control. Then the word came to Jeremiah again. Take another scroll and write on it all the former words that were in the first scroll, which Jehoiachin king of Judah burned. The destruction of the first copy did not require a new message, it required a new copy. Jehoiakim had treated the scroll as though eliminating the object could eliminate the judgment. But the authority of the words had never depended upon the king's willingness to preserve the parchment. Jeremiah summoned Baruch once more. He dictated, and Baruch wrote. Every word from the burned scroll was restored. Many similar words were added. The second scroll was therefore larger than the first. Jehoiakim's attack did not reduce the message. It expanded the testimony against him. His attempt to silence the warning became part of the warning's history. A specific judgment was now delivered concerning the king. "You burned this scroll," Jeremiah charged, and said, "Why have you written that the king of Babylon will certainly come and destroy this land and cut off from it both man and beast?" Jehoiakim's objection exposed what he had found intolerable. The scroll denied that his policy could hold Babylon back. It announced destruction in terms too definite for royal comfort. Burning it allowed him to stage a public rejection of that future before his officials. The response addressed his dynasty, his body, and his household. "He shall have no one to sit on the throne of David." Jehoiakim did have a son who would briefly succeed him, but that reign would not endure. The king's line would not continue securely upon the throne. The royal future he might have imagined for his house would collapse almost as soon as it passed to the next generation. Jehoiakim's corpse, Jeremiah declared, would be exposed to the heat by day and frost by night. The dishonor previously announced against his burial was repeated in another form. The king who sat warmly before his brazier while cutting the scroll would himself be denied the protection and dignity he assumed belonged to royalty. Judgment would also come upon his servants and the inhabitants of Jerusalem because they had not listened. The disaster written in the scroll remained directed toward the whole community that had sustained the rebellion. Yet responsibility was not identical for everyone in the room. Some officials had trembled. Some had warned the king. Some had told Jeremiah and Baruch to hide. The narrative preserved their objections within a court, otherwise defined by Jehoiakim's refusal. They could not force the king to listen, but his authority did not make his decision theirs. The scroll survived through a quieter chain of obedience. Jeremiah received the words, Baruch wrote them, Micaiah carried the report. Officials preserved the document long enough for the king to hear it, and after its destruction, Jeremiah and Baruch began again. What had started as oral proclamation was now becoming a written body of testimony capable of outliving each attempt to suppress it. A prophet could be barred from the temple, a scribe could be hunted, a scroll could be reduced to ash, the words could be dictated again. Outside the palace, Babylon's pressure continued changing Judah's position. After Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar advanced through the region, and Jehoiakim came under Babylonian authority. For 3 years, he served the Babylonian king. Then he rebelled. The decision staked Judah's survival on the hope that Babylon's grip could be broken. Jehoiakim had already rejected the interpretation Jeremiah placed upon the empire's rise. Now his policy enacted that rejection. He would not accept prolonged Babylonian rule as the judgment under which Judah must submit. The consequences would not fall upon the king alone. Bands of Chaldeans, Arameans, Moabites, and Ammonites began moving against Judah. The kingdom found itself exposed to repeated incursions while the greater Babylonian response approached. The royal account judged these events within the long guilt of Judah, including the innocent bloodshed under Manasseh. But Jehoiakim had added his own choices: oppression, the killing of Uriah, the attempt to arrest Jeremiah and Baruch, the destruction of the scroll, and rebellion against the empire whose victory the scroll had announced. In the winter chamber, he had watched Jeremiah's words disappear into fire. Beyond Jerusalem, the army named in those words was preparing to return. During Jehoiakim's reign, Jeremiah was sent to place another household beside Judah as evidence. The Rechabites were a clan descended from Jonadab, son of Rechab, a man remembered from the days of Israel's northern kingdom. Jonadab had commanded his descendants not to drink wine, build houses, sow fields, or plant vineyards. They were to live in tents as resident outsiders, preserving a way of life their ancestor had given them. When Babylonian and Aramean forces moved through the countryside, the Rechabites sought safety inside Jerusalem. Their presence gave Jeremiah the opportunity to test their obedience in public. He brought members of the clan into the temple, entering a chamber associated with the sons of Hanan, a man of God. Priestly chambers surrounded them. Jeremiah placed pitchers of wine and cups before the Rechabites. "Drink wine," he told them. They refused. "We will drink no wine, for Jonadab, son of Rechab, our ancestor, commanded us, 'You and your descendants must never drink wine.'" They explained the rest of the command. They had built no houses, owned no vineyards or fields, and planted no seed. They had lived in tents. Their move into Jerusalem did not represent an abandonment of that rule. They had entered the city because Nebuchadnezzar's forces and the Arameans had made the open country dangerous. Their answer was then carried to the people of Judah. Jonadab had been dead for generations, yet his descendants still observed his instructions. The Lord had spoken to Judah persistently through the prophets, calling the people away from evil and foreign gods so that they might continue in the land. Judah would not listen. A human ancestor had commanded one family, and the family obeyed long after his death. The Lord had repeatedly addressed an entire nation bound to him by covenant, and the nation refused. Jeremiah did not present the Rechabite customs as laws that every Judean should adopt. Their significance lay in the constancy of their response. When invited by a prophet inside the temple to violate their ancestors' instruction, they held to it. Judah had received commands with far greater authority and had treated them as negotiable. Disaster was therefore pronounced again upon Jerusalem. But the Rechabites received a promise. Jonadab, son of Rechab, would never lack a descendant to stand before the Lord. Amid the collapse of royal houses and established institutions, the obedient clan would continue. Jehoiakim, meanwhile, continued to represent the opposite kind of inheritance. He possessed Josiah's throne without Josiah's responsiveness. Jeremiah addressed the royal house, as though calling its members to descend from a height before they were brought down by force. "Go up to Lebanon and cry out," he said. "Raise your voice in Bashan. Cry out from Abarim, for all your lovers are crushed." The lovers were Judah's political partners, the powers on which its rulers depended. Their strength was failing, and alliances could no longer shield Jerusalem. The warning had come while Jehoiakim felt secure, but he had said, "I will not listen." Jeremiah described that refusal as his pattern from youth. The rulers of Judah were called shepherds, but now the wind would drive their shepherds away, and their allies would go into captivity. Shame would follow the policies that had been presented as protection. Jerusalem was pictured as dwelling in Lebanon, nested among cedar because of the timber used in its palaces. Its beauty would offer no immunity. Pain would come like the labor of childbirth when the judgment arrived. Jehoiakim died after an 11-year reign, while Babylonian power closed around the kingdom. His son Jehoiachin succeeded him. The new king was 18 years old. He was also known as Jeconiah and Coniah. His mother was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. His reign continued the course condemned in the royal history, and it lasted only 3 months. By then, Nebuchadnezzar's servants were besieging Jerusalem. The Babylonian king himself came to the city while the siege was underway. Jehoiachin faced a choice his father's rebellion had made unavoidable. Jerusalem could not defeat the empire that had broken Egypt at Carchemish and imposed its rule across the region. The young king went out to Nebuchadnezzar with his mother, his servants, his officials, and his palace officers. He surrendered. Nebuchadnezzar took him captive in the 8th year of the Babylonian king's reign. Jerusalem was not destroyed on this occasion, but the surrender began a deliberate dismantling of Judah's strength. The Babylonians removed treasures from the temple and the royal palace. Gold vessels Solomon had made for the sanctuary were cut up and carried away. Objects that had embodied Jerusalem's wealth and sacred prestige became imperial spoil. Then the deportations began. Jehoiachin was taken to Babylon. His mother went with him, along with his wives, his officials, and the leading people of the land. The Babylonian king deported military officers, craftsmen, and metalworkers, people whose skill, influence, or ability to organize resistance made them valuable and potentially dangerous. The account counts 10,000 captives in the larger removal, including 7,000 fighting men and 1,000 craftsmen and metalworkers. Jerusalem remained inhabited, but it had lost much of the population that sustained its court, defenses, economy, and leadership. Those left behind were largely the poorest people of the land. The exile overturned ordinary judgments about success and failure. Jehoiachin had surrendered and been taken away. The temple had been plundered. Leading families were uprooted from their homes and carried hundreds of miles eastward into Babylonian territory. Those who remained in Judah could look at themselves as the survivors and at the deportees as the ones rejected. Jeremiah's words concerning Jehoiachin gave no easy comfort. "As I live," declared the Lord, "even if Coniah, son of Jehoiakim, were a signet ring on my right hand, I would pull you off." A royal signet represented the king's identity and authority. To describe Jehoiachin as a ring on the divine hand was to place him as close as the image allowed. Even that nearness would not preserve him. He would be handed to Nebuchadnezzar and the forces he feared. Jeremiah addressed the land with a threefold cry. "O land, 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 hear the word of the Lord." The judgment on Jehoiachin reached beyond his removal. He was to be recorded as a man who would not prosper in his days, for none of his offspring would succeed in sitting securely upon David's throne and ruling Judah. The sentence did not mean that Jehoiachin would have no children. It meant that his royal line would not recover the reigning power now taken from him. Babylon would appoint another son of Josiah, rather than allow Jehoiachin's heir to rule. Nebuchadnezzar chose Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, and made him king in Jerusalem. As Pharaoh Necho had renamed Eliakim as Jehoiakim, the Babylonian king changed Mattaniah's name to Zedekiah. Once again, the throne's dependence was displayed through a foreign ruler's authority to name its occupant. Zedekiah was 21 years old. He inherited a kingdom reduced by tribute, raids, siege, plunder, and deportation. The temple still stood. Jerusalem's walls still enclosed the capital. A descendant of David still occupied the palace. But the king ruled by Nebuchadnezzar's appointment, while the previous king and the kingdom's leading citizens lived as captives in Babylon. After the deportation, Jeremiah saw a vision outside the temple. 2 baskets of figs had been placed there. One basket contained very good figs, like the first ripe fruit of the season. The other held figs so bad they could not be eaten. "What do you see, Jeremiah?" the Lord asked. "Figs," he answered. "The good figs are very good, and the bad figs are so bad they cannot be eaten." The explanation reversed the meaning many in Jerusalem would naturally assign to the two groups. The good figs represented the Judean exiles whom God had sent away to Babylon. Their deportation was judgment, but it also placed them under preserving attention. The Lord would watch over them for good and eventually bring them back. He would build them and not tear them down, plant them and not uproot them. He would give them a heart to know him. They would return with their whole heart and again be recognized as his people. The language reached back to Jeremiah's original commission. Uprooting and tearing down were taking place before everyone's eyes. Yet among those forcibly uprooted, the promise of building and planting had begun to take a defined form. The good figs were not called good because captivity was pleasant or because every deportee had acted faithfully. The vision declared what God intended to do with them. Exile, which looked like abandonment, would become the setting in which a future was preserved. The bad figs represented Zedekiah, his officials, the remnant in Jerusalem, and those who had settled in Egypt. Remaining near the temple did not prove divine favor. Possessing the city after others were deported did not make its leaders the secure core of Judah's future. Those who persisted in rebellion would become an object of horror, reproach, mockery, and cursing among the places where they were driven. Sword, famine, and disease would pursue them until they were removed from the land. The first deportation, therefore, became more than a political defeat. It separated appearance from destiny. The captives had lost homes, rank, and proximity to Jerusalem, yet were compared to valuable first ripe fruit. The residents still holding the city were compared to produce already spoiled beyond use. That reversal would govern Jeremiah's next struggle. The exiles needed to learn that their displacement would last long enough to require an entirely different kind of faithfulness. Those in Jerusalem needed to accept that possession of the land no longer proved they were safe. Neither group wanted that message. In Babylon, displaced prophets began promising that captivity would soon end. In Jerusalem, priests and political leaders encouraged the same hope. They expected the temple vessels to return, Jehoiachin to be restored, and Babylon's control to break within a few years. Such predictions offered the exiles a quick homecoming and Zedekiah's court a reason to resist submission. They also erased the force of everything that had happened. Jehoiakim's rebellion, the siege, the surrender, the plunder, and the deportation became a temporary setback rather than the judgment Jeremiah had spent years announcing. Jeremiah would now have to speak across the distance between Jerusalem and Babylon. He would tell the captives how to live under the empire that had removed them. He would confront prophets who offered release before repentance and restoration without endurance. The two baskets remained before the temple, the city still standing, the captives moving east, and Judah's future resting in the group that appeared to have lost everything. Jeremiah wrote to the elders among the exiles, to the priests and prophets, and to all the people Nebuchadnezzar had carried from Jerusalem to Babylon. The letter traveled through official channels. Zedekiah sent Elasah, son of Shaphan, and Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, to Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, and Jeremiah entrusted the message to them. The exiles would receive it from men arriving on royal business, not as a rumor passed secretly across the frontier. Its opening words would have unsettled both the captives and the government that still claimed to represent them. This is what the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar had deported them, but Jeremiah described the removal as an act permitted and governed by God. Babylon had not carried Judah's leading citizens beyond the reach of Israel's God. The empire was neither the final author of their fate nor a place where his word could not find them. Then came the instruction: build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. These commands dismantled the fantasy of an immediate return, one ordinary decision at a time. Building a house meant planning to remain. A garden required cultivation, seasons, and patience before it yielded food. Marriage joined lives to the years ahead. Sons and daughters born in Babylon would know exile not as a short interruption remembered from Jerusalem, but as the world of their childhood. Arranging marriages for that next generation extended the horizon farther still. The exiles had to resist two opposite temptations. They could not behave as though Babylon had become their true and permanent home because return had been promised. But neither could they refuse to live while waiting, treating work, family, and community as pointless because departure must surely be near. Faithfulness now required them to accept the actual length of judgment. Jeremiah gave them an instruction even more surprising than building homes. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Babylon was the capital of the power that had besieged Jerusalem, plundered its treasures, removed its king, and uprooted its families. Yet the captives were not told to sabotage the city, withdraw from its life, or spend every day preparing an uprising. They were to seek its peace and prosperity. The command did not excuse Babylon's violence. Jeremiah had already announced that the empire would answer for its guilt, but the certainty of Babylon's eventual judgment did not release the exiles from responsibility in the present. They could work for the good of the place without mistaking it for the land promised to their ancestors. They could pray for those among whom they lived without declaring the empire righteous. Their own welfare was now bound for a time to the welfare of the foreign city. If Babylon possessed order, food, and peace, Judean households could build, plant, raise children, and preserve a community through the appointed years. Exile would not be survived by refusing every connection to the place of captivity. It would be survived by living faithfully within it. This was precisely why the promises of a swift return were so dangerous. Do not let your prophets and diviners who are among you deceive you, Jeremiah wrote. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. The exiles were not merely passive victims of false prophecy. Many wanted the dreams being offered. A prediction of quick release matched their longing, restored their sense of importance, and spared them the humiliation of accepting that Jeremiah had interpreted the disaster correctly. Prophets supplied the message, but hearers helped sustain it. Those prophets were speaking falsely in the Lord's name. They had not been sent. Jeremiah placed a number against their assurances. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you by bringing you back to this place. The promised return was certain, but it belonged to God's appointed time rather than the timetable of popular prophecy. For many adults who had walked out of Jerusalem as captives, the promise would be fulfilled beyond their own lifetime. Their responsibility was therefore larger than personal rescue. They had to preserve a people capable of receiving a future they might not live to see. The familiar words that followed were spoken first to that displaced community facing decades under foreign rule. I know the plans I have for you, declared the Lord, plans for welfare and not for harm, to give you a future and a hope. The promise did not mean the exile had been a misunderstanding or that hardship would immediately disappear. It stood inside the 70 years after the command to build and before the promise to gather. God's intention for the people could remain good, even while an entire generation lived through the consequences of Judah's rebellion. Restoration would also involve more than relocation. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. Judah had long called upon God while dividing its allegiance among idols, alliances, injustice, and temple rituals used as protection. The future Jeremiah described would bring a different kind of seeking. The scattered people would turn wholeheartedly, and the God they sought would allow himself to be found. I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you. I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. The same authority that had sent them away would gather them. Babylon's roads had carried them east under guard. Those roads would not determine their final direction. Their present task was to live toward that restoration without pretending it had already arrived. Jeremiah then turned the exiles' attention toward Jerusalem. Some of them apparently believed that prophets remaining near the temple offered a more hopeful word than the letter arriving from Anathoth's prophet. They may have regarded those still occupying the city as the secure continuation of Judah, untouched by the worst of the judgment. But sword, famine, and disease still hung over the king on David's throne and the population left behind. Jeremiah repeated the image of inedible figs. Those who had not gone into exile were not automatically the fortunate ones. Their refusal would scatter them among kingdoms and make them an object of horror and reproach. The captives had received a severe mercy. They were alive in Babylon with instructions for how to continue. The city they envied remained on the path toward a siege more terrible than the first. Among the prophets active in exile were Ahab, son of Kaliah, and Zedekiah, son of Messiah. They were Judeans, and they prophesied in the Lord's name. Jeremiah named them directly in the letter and announced that Nebuchadnezzar would hand them over to death. The Babylonian king would execute them before the eyes of the exiles. Their fate would become a curse used by Judean captives. May the Lord make you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. Their offense was not limited to giving an inaccurate prediction. They had committed adultery with their neighbors' wives and spoken lies in God's name. Their public claims to revelation concealed private betrayal. The Lord declared himself the one who knew and witnessed what they had done. The description of their coming deaths carried a grim irony. These men encouraged confidence that Babylon's power would soon be broken, yet the Babylonian king would exercise the power of life and death over them. They claimed divine authority, but their execution would expose them before the very community they had misled. Another confrontation began when a man named Shemaiah the Nehelamite heard Jeremiah's message. Shemaiah was in Babylon, but he wrote letters of his own to Jerusalem. He addressed the people and sent a message to Zephaniah, son of Maaseiah, a priest, with copies for the other priests. The Lord has appointed you priest in place of Jehoiada, he wrote, to be overseer in the house of the Lord over every madman who prophesies, to put him in the stocks and neck irons. The language reduced an unwanted prophet to a dangerous lunatic requiring restraint. Pesha had already used temple authority to beat Jeremiah and place him in stocks. Shemaiah now urged Zephaniah to do the same. Why have you not rebuked Jeremiah of Anathoth, who prophesies to you? Shemaiah cited the letter as evidence against him. Jeremiah had told the exiles that captivity would be long and that they should build houses and plant gardens. To Shemaiah, those instructions were not pastoral guidance, but grounds for punishment. Jeremiah was teaching the captives to settle into a future Shemaiah refused to accept. The dispute now crossed the entire imperial distance. Jeremiah had written from Judah to guide the community in Babylon. Shemaiah replied from Babylon, attempting to mobilize the Jerusalem priesthood against Jeremiah. Competing messages moved along the same roads as royal delegations and imperial orders. Zephaniah did not immediately put Jeremiah in the stocks. He read Shemaiah's letter aloud to him. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah with instructions to answer all the exiles. Because Shemaiah has prophesied to you, though I did not send him, and has made you trust in a lie, I will punish Shemaiah the Nehelamite and his descendants. He would have no one remaining among the people to see the good that would eventually be done for them. The promise of restoration had been extended to the exiled community, but Shemaiah's rebellion against the warning would exclude his house from witnessing it. The judgment fit the deception. Shemaiah claimed to defend hope, yet his false hope endangered the people's ability to reach the promised future. If they rejected Jeremiah's instruction, they might refuse the ordinary acts by which their community would endure, establishing homes, producing food, forming families, and seeking stability. A message that sounded encouraging could help a generation waste the very years it had been given to survive. Jeremiah's letter required a harder courage. The captives had to admit that they would remain under Babylon. They had to release the expectation that Jehoiachin, the temple vessels, and the deported households would all return within months or a few years. They had to pray for a city they would rather see defeated and prepare children for lives their parents had never imagined. At the same time, they were forbidden to surrender their identity to despair. Houses in Babylon were places to live, not proof that Jerusalem had been forgotten. Gardens were investments in survival, not declarations that exile was permanent. Children born there belonged to a people still claimed by a promise. Prayer directed toward the God of Israel could be heard from beyond Judah's borders. The letter gave the exiles a future measured in generations and the empire a limit measured by the same clock. In Jerusalem, however, the shorter predictions remained attractive. Zedekiah's court still possessed a king, priests, walls, and foreign contacts. Envoys from neighboring kingdoms would soon gather to discuss the possibility of resisting Babylon together. Prophets would offer signs that the missing vessels and captive king were coming home. Jeremiah would meet those hopes with a sign worn on his own body. Before Judah could be restored from Babylon's rule, its leaders would have to decide whether they were willing to carry Babylon's yoke. Jeremiah made the yoke from wooden bars and leather straps and placed it upon his neck. At that time, envoys from Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon had come to Jerusalem to meet with Zedekiah. Their presence pointed toward a common political purpose. Each kingdom lived under Babylonian pressure, and together they might hope to coordinate resistance against Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah sent a message back through those envoys to their rulers. The God who made the earth, its people, and its animals had authority to give them into the hand of whomever he chose. For the present, that authority had been given to Nebuchadnezzar. The nations, their lands, and even their animals would serve Babylon, along with Nebuchadnezzar's son and grandson, until Babylon's own appointed time arrived. The empire's rule would end. Many nations and great kings would eventually make Babylon serve them. But that future did not give the gathered kingdoms permission to resist now. Any nation that refused to place its neck under Babylon's yoke would face sword, famine, and disease until Nebuchadnezzar had brought it under control. Kings were warned not to listen to prophets, diviners, dreamers, fortune-tellers, or sorcerers who said, "You will not serve the king of Babylon." Such promises would drive their peoples farther from their own lands. Submission, humiliating as it was, offered the path by which they could remain, cultivate their ground, and live. Jeremiah then delivered the same word directly to Zedekiah. "Bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon. Serve him and his people, and live." The king's responsibility was immediate. He ruled a weakened state whose leading citizens and treasures had already been removed. Resistance might present itself as courage, loyalty, or faith that Jerusalem would be miraculously defended. Jeremiah called it a choice for death. "Why should you and your people die by sword, famine, and disease?" The question stripped rebellion of its heroic appearance. Zedekiah could preserve lives and keep Jerusalem inhabited by accepting the political humiliation already imposed upon him. If he listened instead to prophets promising that Babylon would not prevail, he would be trusting men who had not been sent. The priests and people received a more specific warning. Prophets were telling them that the temple vessels taken in the earlier deportation would soon be returned from Babylon. Jeremiah told them not to listen. If those men were truly prophets and truly possessed the word of the Lord, they should pray that the vessels still remaining in the temple and palace would not be carried away as well. The great bronze pillars, the wheeled stands, the basin, and other sacred objects had not yet been taken. Nebuchadnezzar had left them when he deported Jehoiachin and Jerusalem's leaders. Jeremiah announced that those objects too would be carried to Babylon. They would remain there until the day God attended to them. Only then would they be brought back. The distinction was the same one given to the exiles. Return was promised, but not soon. Hope tied to an invented timetable became another form of rebellion. It encouraged kings to gamble their people's lives and persuaded worshippers that temple treasures mattered more than listening to the God whose house contained them. In the 4th year of Zedekiah, during the 5th month, that conflict came into the temple in the person of Hananiah, son of Azur, a prophet from Gibeon. Before the priests and all the people, Hananiah announced, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I have broken the yoke of the king of Babylon." He gave the promise a precise deadline. Within 2 years, all the temple vessels Nebuchadnezzar had carried away would be restored. Jehoiachin and all the Judean exiles would return with them. Babylon's yoke had already been broken by divine decree. Everything in the message answered a national longing. It promised the recovery of sacred honor, the return of the captive population, and the restoration of the displaced king. Zedekiah's court would not have to build a future beneath Babylonian rule. It only had to endure until the empire's sudden defeat. Jeremiah replied in the hearing of everyone assembled, "Amen. May the Lord do so." He did not object to the restoration itself. He wanted the vessels and captives brought home. His conflict with Hananiah concerned whether God had actually promised that restoration within 2 years. Then Jeremiah appealed to the history of prophecy. The prophets who preceded you and me from ancient times prophesied war, disaster, and disease against many countries and great kingdoms. As for the prophet who prophesies peace, only when that prophet's word comes true will he be recognized as one truly sent by the Lord. A message of peace carried a particular burden because it contradicted the accumulated warnings already standing over Judah. Hananiah's confidence could not authenticate itself. The 2-year prediction would be tested by events. Hananiah did not answer with a longer argument. He stepped forward, took the wooden yoke from Jeremiah's neck, and broke it. Then he turned the action into his own sign. "Thus says the Lord, in this way, within 2 years, I will break the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, from the neck of all the nations." The public confrontation appeared to end with Jeremiah walking away. He did not seize another yoke, struggle with Hananiah, or attempt to win the crowd by force. The broken wood remained a vivid image before the people. Hananiah had taken the object through which Jeremiah embodied submission and snapped it in their sight. Afterward, however, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. He returned to Hananiah with an answer. "You have broken wooden bars, but you have made in their place bars of iron." The act meant to cancel Babylonian rule had instead revealed the severity of resisting it. An iron yoke would be placed upon the nations, and they would serve Nebuchadnezzar. Even the wild animals were described as given under his control. Then Jeremiah spoke to Hananiah personally. "Listen, Hananiah, the Lord has not sent you, yet you have made this people trust in a lie." False prophecy did more than miscalculate the future. Hananiah's message changed what people were willing to do in the present. If Babylon's fall was certain within 2 years, surrender looked faithless and rebellion looked obedient. His promise could move Zedekiah toward decisions that would bring the sword back to Jerusalem. Because Hananiah had preached rebellion against the Lord, Jeremiah announced that he would die that year. "In this very year you shall die." 2 months later, in the 7th month, Hananiah died. His death came before the 2-year deadline he had placed upon Babylon's defeat. The prophet, who promised a rapid return, did not live to see his prediction tested at its end. The wooden yoke had broken in his hands, but Babylon's control remained. Jeremiah's message did not stop with submission. At the same stage in Zedekiah's reign, he entrusted another scroll to a royal official named Seraiah, son of Neriah, Baruch's brother. Seraiah served as the king's quartermaster and accompanied Zedekiah on a journey to Babylon. Jeremiah had written on the scroll, "The disasters appointed for Babylon." The words were expansive because the empire's guilt was expansive. Babylon had been used as a hammer against nations, but it had glorified its own power, destroyed peoples without mercy, plundered sacred places, and made the world drink from the cup of its violence. It had swallowed Zion's wealth and filled itself with what belonged to others. Now the instrument of judgment was told that judgment would reach it. A nation from the north would rise against Babylon and make its land desolate. Its warriors would be thrown into panic. Its defenses would fail, its gates be broken, and its idols put to shame. The great city that held peoples in captivity would be captured. The announcement preserved a crucial boundary around Jeremiah's demand for submission. Judah was not being told that Babylon was morally superior, divinely approved in everything it did, or entitled to permanent mastery. Nebuchadnezzar's yoke belonged to a limited season. The empire could carry out judgment and still become guilty through the manner in which it conquered, boasted, destroyed, and trusted in its gods. Israel and Judah were compared to sheep driven away by lions. Assyria had first devoured the northern kingdom. Babylon had now broken Judah's bones. The power that punished Assyria would also punish Babylon. Then came the promise of return. The scattered flock would be brought back to pasture. Israel would again feed in Carmel, Bashan, Ephraim, and Gilead. Guilt would be sought and forgiven among the remnant God preserved. The people were told to flee from Babylon when its downfall came, each saving his life rather than being swept away in the empire's punishment. They were to remember Jerusalem from far away. Exile had placed distance between them and the temple, but Babylon's grandeur was not to replace the city from which they had been taken. Babylon had been like a golden cup that made the earth drunk. Nations had consumed its order, wealth, intimidation, and violence until they lost their senses. Then the cup itself would fall and shatter. The empire that seemed to hold every future inside its walls would collapse so suddenly that the nations were pictured crying over a wound they could not heal. Jeremiah assigned Seraiah a public reading and a final act. "When you come to Babylon, see that you read all these words aloud." Seraiah was to confess that the Lord had declared the place would be cut off and left without enduring habitation. Then, after finishing the reading, he was to tie a stone to the scroll. He would throw it into the Euphrates. "In this way, Babylon will sink," he was to say, "and rise no more because of the disaster I am bringing upon her." The river running through Babylon would close over the scroll. The visible sign would happen without an army, without an uprising, and without any immediate alteration in imperial power. Babylon would still rule when the stone reached the riverbed. Its palaces, walls, temples, and soldiers would remain above the water. But the empire's end had been assigned as surely as Judah's captivity. Jeremiah therefore stood against two comforting lies at once. He would not allow Jerusalem to claim that Babylon's yoke could be broken whenever its prophets wished, and he would not allow Babylon's present supremacy to pretend it had no limit. The wooden yoke on Jeremiah's neck told Zedekiah what he must do now. The weighted scroll sinking into the Euphrates told the exiles what Babylon would become later. Between those two signs lay the years Judah still had to survive. Zedekiah possessed the narrow authority to choose submission and life, but the voices around him were training the city to interpret surrender as betrayal. Zedekiah eventually chose rebellion. In the 9th year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar returned with his army. Babylonian forces encamped around Jerusalem, built siege works, and cut the capital off from the surrounding land. The political question Jeremiah had forced upon the king was no longer theoretical. The iron yoke now took the form of soldiers, earthworks, and closed roads. Zedekiah sent Pasha, son of Malchiah, and the priest, Zephaniah, son of Maaseiah, to Jeremiah. "Inquire of the Lord for us," they said, "because Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is making war against us. Perhaps the Lord will perform wonders for us, as in times past, so that he will withdraw." The request reached backward toward Jerusalem's memories of deliverance. In the days of Hezekiah, an Assyrian army had threatened the city, and Jerusalem had survived. Stories of the Exodus, the judges, and faithful kings taught that overwhelming enemies could be defeated by divine intervention. Zedekiah wanted to know whether another such reversal was available now, but the king asked for a wonder without committing himself to the obedience Jeremiah had already required. He still wanted rescue from Babylon rather than submission to it. Jeremiah sent the envoys back with an answer. The weapons in the hands of Jerusalem's defenders would fail. Soldiers fighting from the walls would be driven back inside the city. The Lord would fight against Jerusalem with an outstretched hand and a strong arm. The language once associated with Israel's rescue from Egypt now turned against Judah because of its rebellion. Disease would strike the inhabitants. Those who survived it would face sword and famine. Zedekiah, his servants, and the remaining people would be handed over to Nebuchadnezzar, who would show no mercy. Then Jeremiah told the people that two ways lay before them. "See, I am setting before you the way of life and the way of death." The words recalled the covenant choice once placed before Israel. But under siege, the alternatives had become severe. Anyone who remained in Jerusalem would die by sword, famine, or disease. Anyone who went out and surrendered to the Babylonians would live. That person's life would be carried away like spoil rescued from battle. It was an astonishing definition of life. No promise was given that surrender would preserve property, status, or freedom. To pass through the city gate into enemy hands meant abandoning the defenses, accepting Babylon's authority, and trusting that survival beneath conquest was better than death inside a doomed capital. Jeremiah was not advising the people to save themselves from an uncertain military contest. He declared that the outcome had already been decided. Jerusalem had become the object of judgment. The city would be handed to Nebuchadnezzar and he would burn it. The message placed Jeremiah in direct conflict with the logic of siege defense. A government under attack depends upon soldiers remaining at their posts and citizens believing resistance can succeed. Jeremiah told both groups that staying meant death and surrender meant life. To officials trying to hold the city together, his words would sound like assistance to the enemy. Yet from Jeremiah's perspective, the leaders urging resistance were spending lives to preserve a policy already condemned. Before the crisis reached its end, the royal house received one more demand. "Hear the word of the Lord, house of David. Administer justice every morning. Rescue the one who has been robbed from the hand of the oppressor. Even with Babylon outside the walls, the king's obligations inside them had not disappeared. National emergency did not suspend justice. The royal court could not claim to defend Jerusalem while allowing the powerful to prey upon its inhabitants. If oppression continued, judgment would break out like fire and consume without anyone able to extinguish it. The city's geography encouraged confidence. Jerusalem stood on defensible heights, protected by valleys and walls. Its inhabitants could ask, "Who can come down against us? Who can enter our refuge?" The answer was that natural strength could not protect a city being judged according to its conduct. Jerusalem would be punished for the fruit of its deeds, and the fire would consume everything around it. Jeremiah's collected accusations against Judah's rulers revealed why the house of David had arrived at this moment. Kings were meant to protect the vulnerable, restrain violence, and govern in righteousness. Instead, the monarchy had become another place where power served itself. Some rulers had pursued luxury through oppression. Others had relied on foreign patrons, rejected correction, or encouraged the nation to resist the very judgment it had earned. The palace still belonged to David's line, but dissent could not substitute for Davidic responsibility. Jeremiah addressed the leadership as shepherds. "Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture." The rulers had been entrusted with a flock. Their policies were supposed to preserve the people, yet Judah was being scattered under their care. The first deportation had already carried thousands into Babylon. More displacement would follow if Jerusalem continued resisting. The shepherds who failed to attend to the flock would themselves be attended to in judgment, but scattering would not be the last action. God would gather a remnant from the countries where the people had been driven and return them to their pasture. New shepherds would care for them so that they would no longer live in terror or go missing. Jeremiah then spoke of a future king unlike the rulers who had brought Judah to collapse. Days would come when a righteous branch would be raised for David. He would reign wisely and execute justice and righteousness in the land. Judah would be saved, Israel would dwell securely, and the king would be known by a name declaring that the Lord was their righteousness. That promise did not validate Zedekiah merely because he occupied David's throne. It judged him by contrast. His name meant the Lord is righteousness, but the righteous rule anticipated by Jeremiah was not being realized through his indecision. The king had been told how life might be preserved, yet he remained caught between the word he sought privately and the policies his court pursued publicly. The future restoration would be so great that Israel's return from the lands of exile would stand beside the exodus from Egypt in national memory. The scattered people would again live in their own land. But the existence of that future made false promises in the present no less dangerous. Jeremiah turned from failed kings to the prophets who supported them. His heart was broken because men speaking in the Lord's name had filled the land with corruption. Adultery, deception, and abuse of power spread beneath religious language. Prophets and priests alike acted without reverence, and wickedness had entered even the temple. Some prophets in the former northern kingdom had spoken by Baal and led Israel astray. The prophets of Jerusalem had done something still more appalling. They committed adultery, walked in lies, and strengthened evildoers so that no one turned from wickedness. By continually assuring the guilty that peace remained secure, they removed the urgency of repentance. They told those who despise the word of the Lord, "It shall be well with you." They told everyone following a stubborn heart, "No disaster shall come upon you." Such messages did not comfort the weak. They fortified rebellion. A king hearing them could interpret resistance as courage. Officials could dismiss Jeremiah as a defeatist. Citizens could assume that temple, dynasty, and city would remain protected, regardless of conduct. Jeremiah challenged the prophet's claim to divine counsel. If they had stood in the Lord's counsel and heard his word, they would have proclaimed it faithfully. Their message would have turned people away from evil, rather than making evil easier to continue. The approaching judgment was compared to a storm driven by fury. It would not turn back until its purpose was accomplished. Only afterward would the people understand it fully. Events would expose which message had come from God. I did not send the prophets, the Lord declared, yet they ran. I did not speak to them, yet they prophesied. Distance offered no shelter for deception. God was not present only nearby, unable to see what happened in secret. He filled heaven and earth. A prophet could claim to have received a dream, but a dream was not authenticated by confidence or repetition. Jeremiah did not reject every dream simply because it was a dream. He distinguished between the prophet who truly received one and the person who stole words from another, borrowing the sound of revelation without its source. Let the prophet who has a dream tell the dream, the Lord said, but let the one who has my word speak it faithfully. What has straw in common with grain? The difference would become clear in what each message produced. Straw might fill space, but it could not nourish. A pleasing prediction might spread quickly, but it could not sustain the people through what was coming. Is not my word like fire, and like a hammer that breaks the rock in pieces? Jehoiachin had put the written word into a fire. Now the word itself was described as fire. Hananiah had broken the wooden yoke, but the word had replaced it with iron. Every attempt to overpower the message had revealed the hardness of what resisted it. The false prophets repeated one another and attached the formula, "declares the Lord," to their inventions. They treated their own tongues as sufficient authority. Their lying dreams caused the people to forget the Lord, just as their ancestors had forgotten him through Baal. Jeremiah even warned the people against casually asking, "What is the burden of the Lord?" The phrase had become a way of mocking or manipulating prophetic speech. The people wanted an oracle they could discuss, test for political advantage, or turn into a slogan. But each person's own words had become a burden through the distortion of what God had said. The proper question was simpler. What has the Lord answered? Or, what has the Lord spoken? Zedekiah had asked for an answer. Jeremiah had given one. No miraculous rescue had been promised. No assurance had been offered that the walls would hold. The king and people were told that Babylon would prevail, and they were shown the one course that still led to life. As the siege continued, that answer narrowed every remaining decision. Food would diminish, fear would spread, officials would demand unity, prophets would interpret endurance as evidence that deliverance might still come. Zedekiah would continue summoning Jeremiah while hesitating to obey him. Then movement south of Jerusalem appeared to offer the court exactly the reversal it wanted. Egypt was sending an army, and the Babylonians began responding to the threat. For a moment, the siege around Jerusalem loosened. The gates, that had seemed closed by an irreversible judgment, opened again toward the countryside. The city would soon reveal what it intended to do with the reprieve. Before the pressure lifted, Zedekiah and the people of Jerusalem had made a covenant. The law of Moses required Hebrew servants to be released after 6 years of service. No Israelite was meant to hold a fellow member of the covenant community in permanent bondage. Yet the leading families of Judah had kept Hebrew men and women in servitude beyond the appointed term. Now, with Babylon's army surrounding the city, the king proclaimed liberty. The officials and people entered into a solemn agreement that every Hebrew male and female servant would be set free. No Judean would continue to enslave a fellow Judean. They formalized the covenant in the temple, cutting a calf in two and passing between its pieces. The ceremony gave visible force to their promise. Those who walked between the divided portions placed themselves under the fate represented by the animal. If they violated the covenant, they accepted judgment upon themselves. Then they obeyed. The princes and people released the men and women they had held. For a moment, the besieged city performed the justice its kings had long neglected. Masters surrendered legal control over servants whose labor benefited their households. The proclamation of liberty moved beyond speech and changed the condition of actual people. But when the Babylonian army withdrew from Jerusalem to meet the Egyptian advance, the city's danger appeared to recede. Pharaoh Hophra's army had come out of Egypt. The Babylonians lifted the immediate siege and moved away to confront it. After months of confinement, Jerusalem could see what looked like the beginning of deliverance. The imperial ring around the city had opened without Zedekiah surrendering. Egypt, the ally Jeremiah had warned them not to trust, seemed to have accomplished what the court had hoped. The reprieve changed how Jerusalem's leaders valued the covenant they had made under pressure. They reversed their decision. The people who had freed their Hebrew servants took them back and forced them into servitude again. Men and women who had been told they were free were brought once more under the authority of their former masters. The act revealed what the emergency promise had been worth. When Babylon threatened every household, the powerful had accepted reform. When the threat appeared to loosen, they reclaimed the advantage they had surrendered. Their obedience lasted only as long as they believed catastrophe was unavoidable. Jeremiah confronted them in the name of the covenant they had invoked. When the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt, he commanded that a Hebrew servant be released after the appointed years. Their ancestors had not listened, but this generation had recently turned and done what was right. They had proclaimed liberty to their neighbors and made a covenant in the temple called by the Lord's name. Then they had profaned that name. They had taken back the servants they released and compelled them to become servants again. The people had declared liberty before God and then treated both the freed person and the solemn covenant as temporary instruments of survival. Therefore, Jeremiah announced a different proclamation of liberty. You have not obeyed me by proclaiming liberty, each to his brother and his neighbor. So I proclaim liberty to you, to the sword, to disease, and to famine. The word was turned against them. They had refused the freedom owed to their neighbors. They would be released from protection and handed over to the forces of death. The city's leaders had acted as though the departing Babylonian army had freed them from consequences. Jeremiah declared that their treachery had exposed them more fully to those consequences. The officials who passed between the pieces of the calf would become like the calf whose divided body had sealed their promise. Their bodies would be given to birds and wild animals. Zedekiah and his officials would be handed over to the Babylonian army. The enemy had withdrawn, but Jeremiah spoke of its return as a command already given. I will bring them back to this city. They will fight against it, capture it, and burn it. Judah's towns would become desolate. The moment that looked like rescue would become evidence at their trial. They had been given space to change course and used it to restore oppression. Zedekiah sent another delegation to Jeremiah. This time Jehoiachin, son of Shelemiah, went with Zephaniah the priest. Please pray to the Lord our God for us, they asked. The request came while Jeremiah was still able to move freely among the people. The Babylonian forces had left their positions around Jerusalem because of Pharaoh's army, and the city had not yet been enclosed again. The king's officials asked for prayer, but the answer did not support the confidence rising in Jerusalem. This is what you shall say to the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of me. Pharaoh's army, which has come out to help you, will return to its own land, to Egypt. Egypt's movement had interrupted the siege. It would not end it. The Chaldeans will return and fight against this city. They will capture it and burn it. Jeremiah warned the court not to deceive itself with the thought that the Babylonians had gone away for good. Even an astonishing military loss would not alter the declared outcome. Even if you were to defeat the entire army of the Chaldeans fighting against you, and only wounded men remained in their tents, they would rise up and burn this city. The force of the statement lay in its refusal to make Babylonian strength the ultimate issue. Jerusalem would not survive simply by finding a stronger ally or inflicting enough casualties. The city's judgment had not been calculated from troop numbers. Egypt could threaten Babylon's flank, and Judah could imagine the besiegers broken, but the word against Jerusalem would still stand. The Egyptian army returned home. The Babylonian forces turned back toward Jerusalem. Before they completed the encirclement, Jeremiah attempted to leave the city and go into the territory of Benjamin. He intended to attend to a matter of property among his people there. At the Benjamin gate, an officer named Irijah, son of Shelemiah, son of Hananiah, stopped him. "You are deserting to the Chaldeans," Irijah accused. The charge was plausible to anyone who had heard Jeremiah preach surrender. He had openly told the inhabitants that those who went out to the Babylonians would live. Now, while the enemy was temporarily away and expected to return, he was attempting to pass through a gate leading toward Benjamin. The officer interpreted Jeremiah's movement through the message he already regarded as disloyal. Jeremiah denied it. "That is false. I am not deserting to the Chaldeans." Irijah refused to listen. He arrested Jeremiah and brought him before the officials. The men responsible for the city's defense were already hostile to the prophet, who said their strategy would fail. They became enraged, had him beaten, and confined him in the house of Jonathan the secretary, which had been converted into a prison. Jeremiah was placed in a vaulted cell or dungeon and remained there many days. The reprieve that briefly opened Jerusalem's roads had now closed around him personally. He had warned that the Babylonians would return. The officials answered by imprisoning him as a would-be defector before the prediction had finished becoming reality. When the siege resumed, Zedekiah sent for him in secret. Jeremiah was taken from the prison to the royal palace. The king questioned him privately. "Is there any word from the Lord?" After the failed Egyptian intervention, the broken covenant, and the return of Babylon's army, Zedekiah still hoped there might be another word, perhaps a changed word, a path that would preserve his resistance while removing its consequence. "There is," Jeremiah replied. Then he gave the king the same essential answer. "You will be handed over to the king of Babylon." Imprisonment had not altered the message. Jeremiah stood before the man with power over his confinement and repeated the outcome that had made him dangerous to the court. Then he challenged the justice of his treatment. "What wrong have I done to you, your servants, or this people, that you have put me in prison? Where are your prophets who prophesied to you, saying, 'The king of Babylon will not come against you or against this land'?" The question now had events behind it. The prophets of reassurance had promised that Babylon's power would break. Yet Nebuchadnezzar's army had come, departed only to answer Egypt, and returned. Jeremiah was in prison, while the men whose message had failed had not been made to answer for the danger they encouraged. He pleaded with Zedekiah not to send him back to Jonathan's house. "Do not let me return there, or I will die." The king granted this request. Jeremiah was transferred to the courtyard of the guard, a place of confinement within the royal compound. Zedekiah also ordered that he receive a loaf of bread each day from the baker's street, as long as bread remained in the city. The order preserved Jeremiah's life, but its final phrase measured Jerusalem's condition. Bread was no longer assumed to be continuously available. The resumed siege was constricting the food supply, and the prophet's daily ration would last only while the city still had bread to give. Zedekiah's behavior revealed the division governing him. He would not publicly follow Jeremiah's command to surrender, but neither would he dismiss him entirely. He allowed officials to imprison the prophet, then summoned him privately. He heard the same prediction, spared Jeremiah from the dungeon, and arranged his food. The king feared the message enough to keep asking for it, yet feared the cost of obeying it more. Jerusalem's other surviving strongholds were disappearing. The Babylonian army fought against Lachish and Azekah, fortified cities southwest of the capital. They were among the last towns of Judah still holding out. Their resistance mattered because Jerusalem was not falling in isolation. The kingdom around it was being reduced until the capital stood almost alone. Inside the walls, the social order had exposed itself under stress. Masters had freed servants when death seemed near and enslaved them again when relief appeared possible. Officials had treated a property journey as desertion because Jeremiah's counsel contradicted their war effort. The king had sought prayer, received an answer, and continued along the course that answer condemned. Egypt had been the great external hope. Its army had moved, Babylon had withdrawn, and Jerusalem had briefly watched the siege lift. Then Egypt went home. The Babylonians returned. The covenant breakers discovered that the liberty they proclaimed and revoked had not saved them. Jeremiah remained under guard, receiving bread one loaf at a time as the city's stores diminished. And while Jerusalem waited for another reversal, the imprisoned prophet was about to make a purchase that assumed the city would be lost, and that fields in Judah would one day be bought again. The opportunity came in the 10th year of Zedekiah, while the Babylonian army was still besieging Jerusalem, and Jeremiah remained confined in the courtyard of the guard. The word of the Lord told him that his cousin Hanamel, son of Shallum, would come and say, "Buy my field at Anathoth, because the right of redemption belongs to you." Land within an Israelite family was not treated simply as property to be sold to the highest bidder. When hardship forced someone to sell, the nearest relative with the right of redemption could purchase it and preserve it within the family line. Hanamel was about to appeal to that responsibility. But Anathoth lay in territory controlled by the Babylonians. Jeremiah could not freely inspect or occupy the field. He was a prisoner inside a city that he had repeatedly said would fall. From any ordinary financial perspective, the purchase was absurd. The land had little immediate value to a buyer who expected conquest, deportation, and years of imperial rule. Then Hanamel entered the courtyard of the guard, exactly as Jeremiah had been told. "Buy my field at Anathoth in the land of Benjamin," he said, "for the right of possession and redemption is yours. Buy it for yourself." Jeremiah recognized the visit as confirmation of the word he had received. He bought the field. The purchase was conducted carefully, without pretending that approaching catastrophe made legal order irrelevant. Jeremiah weighed out 17 shekels of silver. He signed the deed, sealed it, called witnesses, and weighed the money on scales. He took both versions of the deed, the sealed copy containing the terms and conditions, and the open copy available for consultation. The transaction took place before Hanamel, the witnesses who had signed the document, and the Judeans sitting in the courtyard of the guard. The prophet's confinement turned the prison yard into a public place of purchase. Men who knew that Babylon surrounded Jerusalem watched Jeremiah pay real silver for occupied land. Then he handed the documents to Baruch. In the presence of the witnesses, Jeremiah instructed him to place both the sealed deed and the open copy in an earthenware jar, so they would be preserved for a long time. The reason was given in a sentence that contradicted everything visible around them. Houses, fields, and vineyards will again be bought in this land. Jeremiah had shattered an earthenware flask to represent a city that could not repair itself. Now another clay vessel was used for preservation. Inside it, the deed could outlast the siege, the fall of Jerusalem, the removal of its population, and the years when Anathoth remained beyond the purchaser's reach. The act did not deny Babylon's victory. It depended upon it. If Jeremiah believed Jerusalem would escape and normal business would continue, buying the field would carry no special meaning. He purchased because exile was coming and because exile would end. After giving the deed to Baruch, Jeremiah prayed. He began with the God who had made heaven and earth by great power, the one for whom nothing was too difficult. He recalled the history behind the present crisis, the deliverance from Egypt, the signs and wonders, the gift of the land, and Israel's failure to obey after entering it. The land had flowed with abundance, yet the people had not walked in the covenant. Now the siege ramps had reached Jerusalem. Sword, famine, and disease were doing exactly what had been announced. The city was being handed to the Chaldeans. Jeremiah could see the siege works. The judgment was no longer an image leaning from the north. It surrounded him. Then he placed the purchase before God. Yet you, Lord God, have said to me, buy the field for money and call in witnesses, though the city is being handed over to the Chaldeans. Jeremiah had obeyed, but obedience did not prevent him from bringing the apparent contradiction into prayer. The field was occupied. The city was doomed. The deed was sealed for a future no one in the courtyard could see. The answer began by returning Jeremiah's own confession to him. I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too difficult for me? Jerusalem would indeed be given into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. The Babylonians would enter and set the city on fire, burning houses where people had offered incense to Baal and poured out drink offerings to other gods. Israel and Judah had persisted in provocation from their earliest days. Kings, officials, priests, prophets, and citizens had turned their backs, refused instruction, and placed detestable objects in the temple. They had built the high places of Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed sons and daughters to Molech. The field purchase would not cancel any of this. Hope was not an alternative interpretation that declared Judah innocent. The deed could promise restoration only because the judgment had first been faced without disguise. Then the answer moved beyond the siege. The people would be gathered from the countries to which they had been driven. They would be brought back to the land and made to dwell securely. Their relationship with God would no longer rest upon public claims contradicted by settled rebellion. They will be my people, and I will be their God. They would receive one heart and one way, learning to fear the Lord for their own good and for the good of their children. God would not turn away from doing good to them, and he would put reverence within them so that they would not continually turn away from him. The covenant would be everlasting. The restoration was described with deliberate intensity. God would rejoice in doing good to them and plant them securely in the land with all his heart and soul. Jeremiah's original commission had joined uprooting with planting. Now, while the uprooting was visible everywhere, the promise of planting acquired the image of a preserved deed in a clay jar. As I have brought all this great disaster upon this people, so I will bring upon them all the good I have promised. Fields would again be purchased in the territory dismissed as desolate, without people or animals, and handed over to Babylon. Silver would again be weighed. Deeds would again be signed, sealed, and witnessed. Transactions would take place in Benjamin, around Jerusalem, throughout Judah, in the hill country, the western foothills, and the southern lands. The details mattered. Restoration was not left as a vague feeling of comfort. Families would return to places, cultivate ground, transfer property, and rebuild the ordinary structures of community. The document in Baruch's care was a legal claim upon that future. The words of consolation gathered around Jeremiah's imprisonment widened from one field to the whole scattered nation. The wounded condition of Judah could not be treated lightly. Its injury was described as incurable, with no ally defending its cause and no medicine able to close the wound. The nations Judah had pursued had forgotten it. Its punishment corresponded to the weight of its guilt. But those who devoured Judah would themselves be devoured. Those who plundered it would become plunder. The wounded people would receive healing. The city, dismissed as an outcast, would be restored. Thanksgiving would again come from its inhabitants. Children would play in its streets. The community would be established before the Lord, and those who oppressed it would answer for what they had done. The promise reached both Israel and Judah. The people who survived the sword would find favor in the wilderness. The Lord spoke of loving them with an everlasting love and drawing them with steadfast faithfulness. Again, I will build you, and you shall be built. Tambourines would be taken up again. Vineyards would be planted on the hills of Samaria, and those who planted them would enjoy their fruit. Watchmen in the hill country of Ephraim would call the people to rise and go up to Zion. The road of return was to be marked. The exiles were told to set up signposts and fix their attention upon the highway by which they had gone away. The path that carried them outward would one day become the path home. A voice was heard at Ramah, in the territory of Benjamin. Rachel, the ancestral mother associated with Israel's tribes, was pictured weeping for her children because they were gone. Ramah would become linked with the gathering and removal of captives. The lament did not minimize that loss. Mothers would grieve for sons and daughters taken beyond their reach. Then grief received an answer. Restrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your labor. They will return from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future. The return would include recognition. Ephraim was pictured grieving over his own discipline, asking to be restored because he had been like an untrained calf. The Lord answered as a parent whose compassion was stirred for a beloved child. Judah's towns would again be inhabited. Farmers and shepherds would live together. The weary would be refreshed, and those faint from sorrow would be satisfied. Yet rebuilding the old arrangements alone would not solve the failure that had destroyed them. The people had possessed covenant commands before and broken them. They had heard prophetic words and rejected them. They had stood in the temple while practicing injustice. Restoration required a work deeper than returning a population to the same soil. The days are coming, Jeremiah announced, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It would not be like the covenant made when Israel was led out of Egypt, the covenant they broke, though the Lord had been faithful to them. The difference would be expressed within the people themselves. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. The law found in the temple during Josiah's reign had been read aloud to the nation. The king had responded, but the people's allegiance had not held. In the promised covenant, divine instruction would not remain merely on a scroll before them. It would shape their inner life. No one would need to sustain the community by empty claims of knowing the Lord while living against him. From the least to the greatest, the people would know him. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Forgiveness was the foundation of the renewed relationship. Judah's guilt would not be denied or quietly forgotten because time had passed. It would be dealt with by the God against whom the people had rebelled. The permanence of the promise was compared to the established order of creation. The sun governing the day and the moon and stars governing the night testified that Israel would not cease to be a people. Only if the heavens could be measured and the foundations of the earth fully explored would the entire offspring of Israel be rejected for all they had done. Jerusalem itself would be rebuilt beyond its ruined limits. The measuring line would extend over places associated with corpses, ashes, and uncleanness. The entire city would become holy and would not again be uprooted and overthrown. While Jeremiah remained confined, another word came to him concerning the city, whose houses were being torn down to strengthen defenses against the siege ramps and sword. Call to me, and I will answer you, and tell you great and hidden things you have not known. The immediate answer, still named death, Babylonian forces would fill Jerusalem's damaged houses with the bodies of those struck down under judgment. But after that devastation, the city would receive health and healing. Captives from Judah and Israel would return. Guilt would be cleansed and forgiven. Jerusalem would become a source of joy and praise among the nations when they heard of the good done for it. The places about to fall silent would again hear celebration, thanksgiving, and the voices of bridegroom and bride. Worshippers would once more bring offerings to the temple. Outside the restored towns, shepherds would again count their sheep as they passed beneath the hand. In the hill country, the lowlands, the south, Benjamin, and the villages around Jerusalem, flocks would again occupy the land. These promises did not open the prison gate or remove the Babylonian army. Jeremiah still depended upon a diminishing daily ration. Zedekiah still refused the path placed before him. But Baruch now held two deeds to a field in enemy territory. One remained open for inspection. The other was sealed for the long future. Jeremiah had invested 17 shekels in the claim that Babylon would not own Anathoth forever. As famine tightened around Jerusalem, the deed waited inside its clay jar, and the officials inside the city turned their attention again toward the prophet who kept telling them that survival required surrender. Shephatiah, son of Matan, Gedaliah, son of Pashur, Jehucal, son of Shelemiah, and Pashur, son of Malchiah, heard Jeremiah speaking to the people who remained in the city. "This is what the Lord says, whoever stays in this city will die by sword, famine, or disease. But whoever goes out to the Chaldeans will live. He will escape with his life." Jeremiah also repeated the outcome of the siege. "This city will certainly be handed over to the army of the king of Babylon, and he will capture it." To the officials, these words threatened the city from within. Jerusalem's defense depended upon soldiers continuing to believe that holding the walls was worth the hunger and danger. Jeremiah was telling them that their sacrifices could not save the city and that the only surviving road led through surrender. The officials went to Zedekiah. "This man should be put to death," they said. "He is weakening the hands of the soldiers who remain in this city and the hands of all the people by speaking such words to them. This man is not seeking the welfare of this people, but their harm." They framed the accusation around welfare, the very issue on which Jeremiah had challenged Judah's rulers for years. In their judgment, patriotism required maintaining resistance. Anyone encouraging surrender was helping Babylon. Jeremiah's answer was that continued resistance would kill the people the officials claimed to protect. The difference between them was no longer whether Jerusalem faced danger. It was which choice still offered life. Zedekiah surrendered the prophet to them. "He is in your hands," the king said. "The king can do nothing against you." The words revealed how little command remained in the palace. Zedekiah bore the royal title, but he would not oppose his officials even when they demanded the death of the man he continued consulting. He did not pass a formal sentence. He simply withdrew his protection. The officials took Jeremiah from the courtyard of the guard and brought him to a cistern belonging to Malchiah, a member of the royal family. It lay within the same guarded court where Jeremiah had been confined. They lowered him by ropes. The cistern contained no water. Its remaining depth was filled with mud, and Jeremiah sank into it. The officials did not have to strike him with a sword. They could leave hunger, exposure, and the mud to accomplish the death they wanted. With food already failing in Jerusalem, a prisoner abandoned below ground might disappear without a public execution. The prophet who had warned that Judah was sinking under the consequence of its choices was now physically trapped in the mire. Hananiah had broken the yoke from his neck. Pasha had put him in stocks. Uriah had arrested him as a deserter. The officials had beaten and imprisoned him. Each confrontation had attempted to restrain the message by restraining the man. This time, Jeremiah could not walk away. He could not climb the walls of the cistern or pull himself from the mud. His life depended upon someone above deciding that the king's permission was not the final word. That person was Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian serving as a eunuch in the royal palace. He heard what had been done to Jeremiah. Zedekiah was sitting at the Benjamin Gate, one of the places where a king could hear public matters and exercise judgment. Ebed-Melech left the palace and went to him. "My lord the king," he said, "these men have acted wickedly in all they did to Jeremiah the prophet. They have thrown him into the cistern, and he will die there of hunger, for there is no bread left in the city." Ebed-Melech did what Zedekiah had refused to do. He named the official's action as evil and spoke openly for Jeremiah's life. As a foreigner and palace servant, he stood outside the groups whose authority Jeremiah had spent years confronting. Yet he recognized the injustice that Judah's leaders justified as national necessity. The king responded, "Take 30 men from here with you and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the cistern before he dies." Zedekiah now used the authority he had just claimed not to possess. He did not confront the officials or explain the reversal. He gave Ebed-Melech enough men to carry out the rescue. Ebed-Melech went to a room beneath the palace treasury and collected worn clothes and old rags. Then he returned to the cistern and lowered them to Jeremiah with the ropes. "Put these old clothes and rags under your arms to pad the ropes," he called down. The care was practical and precise. Jeremiah's weight would have to be drawn upward by men pulling on ropes beneath his arms. Ebed-Melech provided padding to protect him during the lift. Jeremiah arranged the cloth beneath the ropes. The men pulled, raising him out of the mud and back into the courtyard of the guard. He remained a prisoner, but he was alive. While Jeremiah was still confined there, a word came concerning the man who had rescued him. Ebed-Melech was to hear that Jerusalem's announced disaster would indeed occur. He would see the city overtaken, but he would not be handed over to the men he feared or fall by the sword. His life would be given to him as a prize of war. The reason was stated directly. He had trusted in the Lord. Ebed-Melech had acted while the city's recognized religious and political leaders were refusing the prophetic word. His trust appeared in the decision to approach the king, accuse powerful officials of wickedness, and draw Jeremiah from the cistern. He could not save Jerusalem, but he did not allow the city's collapse to excuse participation in its injustice. Zedekiah then sent for Jeremiah again. The king arranged to meet him at the third entrance to the temple. The location allowed another private conversation away from the officials who had demanded Jeremiah's death. "I am going to ask you something," Zedekiah said. "Do not hide anything from me." Jeremiah answered with the danger plainly before them. "If I tell you, will you not surely put me to death? And if I give you counsel, you will not listen to me." The king's history justified both concerns. He had repeatedly requested the word and repeatedly refused its direction. He had moved Jeremiah out of the dungeon but kept him confined. He had then handed him to men seeking his death and rescued him only after Ebed-Melech intervened. Zedekiah swore secretly to Jeremiah by the living God, the giver of life, "I will not put you to death or hand you over to these men who seek your life." With that assurance, Jeremiah gave him the answer one final time. "If you surrender to the officers of the king of Babylon, your life will be spared, and this city will not be burned. You and your household will live." The possibility still existed. After rebellion, siege, Egyptian intervention, renewed siege, broken promises, imprisonment, and the cistern, surrender could preserve the king's life and prevent Jerusalem from being burned. The offered outcome was more generous than Zedekiah's policy deserved. He was not being told that surrender would restore his independence or preserve his honor. Babylonian authority would remain, and he would have to walk out to the officers of the empire he had defied. But his family could live, and the city could be spared destruction by fire. "If you refuse to surrender," Jeremiah continued, "the city will be handed over to the Chaldeans. They will burn it, and you yourself will not escape from their hands." The choice was now placed before Zedekiah without any remaining political disguise. The king revealed what held him back. "I am afraid of the Judeans who have deserted to the Chaldeans," he said. "I fear that I will be handed over to them, and they will mistreat me." Some Judeans had already followed the path Jeremiah prescribed. They had left the city and gone over to Babylon. Zedekiah feared facing them after remaining inside and prolonging the siege. As king, he could surrender to Babylonian officers, but once in their custody, he could not control whom they allowed near him or what humiliations might follow. His fear was personal and immediate. He was weighing possible abuse at the hands of defectors against Jeremiah's certainty of capture and fire. The danger he imagined beyond the gate felt more powerful to him than the disaster already closing around the city. "They will not hand you over," Jeremiah said. Then he urged Zedekiah to obey. "Listen to the voice of the Lord in what I am telling you. Then it will go well with you, and your life will be spared." The king's choice would affect far more than his own safety. Jeremiah described what would happen if he refused to go out. The women remaining in the royal palace would be brought before Babylonian officers. They would speak a taunt over Zedekiah. The trusted friends who had encouraged him had deceived and overpowered him. Once his feet had sunk into the mud, those allies had turned away. The image reached back into Jeremiah's recent confinement. He had sunk into literal mud because Zedekiah yielded to his officials. Now the king was warned that his own confidence had led him into a trap from which they could not rescue him. The relationships that sustained his resistance would fail at the moment their advice reached its consequence. Zedekiah's wives and sons would be led out to the Chaldeans. The king himself would not escape. He would be seized by Babylon's forces, and Jerusalem would be burned. The final decision still belonged to him. Jeremiah had answered the concern about the deserters and stated the cost of refusal. Nothing more was needed to make the choice clear. Zedekiah did not order the city to surrender. Instead, he turned to the secrecy of their conversation. "Do not let anyone know about these words," he told Jeremiah, "and you will not die." The king anticipated that the officials would question the prophet. If they learned the substance of the meeting, Jeremiah's life might again be in danger. Zedekiah instructed him to say that he had pleaded not to be returned to Jonathan's house, where he feared he would die. The officials did come. They questioned Jeremiah about his conversation with the king. Jeremiah told them what Zedekiah had instructed him to say. Because no one had overheard the private exchange, they could not challenge his account, and the questioning ended. The secret remained between the king and the prophet. That secrecy captured the shape of Zedekiah's rule. He wanted the word near enough to consult, but hidden from the men who influenced his decisions. He could protect Jeremiah quietly, but would not obey him publicly. He feared Babylon, feared his officials, feared the Judean deserters, and feared what surrender would make visible about his failure. Every attempt to avoid one feared outcome moved him closer to the greater one. Jeremiah remained in the courtyard of the guard. He had no power to open the gates or compel the king. His responsibility was to speak, and he had spoken. The path to life had been stated in the temple entrance, with the siege still underway. Beyond the walls, Babylon continued its work. Inside them, food was disappearing. The king had heard that surrender could save his household and preserve the city from fire. He returned Jeremiah to confinement and kept the warning secret. The siege continued until the day Jerusalem was taken. In the 11th year of Zedekiah, on the 9th day of the 4th month, Famine had become severe, and there was no food left for the people. Then the Babylonians broke through the wall. Their officers entered Jerusalem and took positions at the middle gate. The enemy Jeremiah had first seen as a boiling pot from the north, now sat inside the capital, occupying the place from which authority was exercised. The siege had become conquest. When Zedekiah and the remaining soldiers saw them, they fled by night. They escaped through a gate between two walls near the king's garden and headed toward the Arabah, the deep valley running south from the Jordan. The Babylonian army pursued. They overtook Zedekiah on the plains of Jericho. His soldiers scattered, leaving the king who had feared surrender alone in enemy hands. He was captured and taken north to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. Their judgment was pronounced upon him. Zedekiah's sons were brought forward and killed before his eyes. The nobles of Judah were executed with them. Then the Babylonians put out Zedekiah's eyes. The death of his sons was the final sight he carried into darkness. He was bound with bronze shackles and taken to Babylon, where he remained imprisoned until his death. Jeremiah's warnings had converged upon him exactly where his evasions had led. Captured after attempting to flee, deprived of his household, and carried into the empire whose yoke he had refused. Jerusalem remained under Babylonian control. A month after the breach, Nebuzaradan, commander of Nebuchadnezzar's imperial guard, arrived to complete its destruction. He burned the temple. He burned the royal palace and the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building was given to the flames. The Babylonian troops tore down the walls surrounding the city, exposing the capital that had trusted in its heights and defenses. The great bronze pillars at the temple were broken apart. So were the wheeled stands and the immense bronze basin. The metal was carried to Babylon. Priestly utensils, bowls, lamp tools, basins, dishes, and objects of gold and silver were taken as spoil. The sacred vessels that false prophets had promised would soon return now traveled east with everything left from the earlier plunder. Nebuzaradan deported most of the surviving population. The poor who owned nothing were left behind, and some were given vineyards and fields. Those once excluded from land now received portions in a kingdom emptied of its powerful families. Leading officials were seized. Sariah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the second priest, temple doorkeepers, a military officer, royal advisors, and the secretary responsible for mustering the army. They were brought to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah and executed. The monarchy had fallen, the temple had burned, the walls had been dismantled. Jerusalem's leadership was dead, captive, or scattered. Jeremiah survived the city whose fall he had spent his life announcing. Nebuchadnezzar had given orders concerning him. He was not to be harmed, and his requests were to be granted. Amid the gathering of captives at Ramah, Jeremiah was found bound in chains among those being taken to Babylon. Nebuzaradan released him. "The Lord your God pronounced this disaster against this place," the commander told him, "and now he has brought it about. Because you sinned against the Lord and did not obey his voice, this has happened." A Babylonian officer spoke over ruined Judah the interpretation its kings had rejected. He offered Jeremiah a choice. The prophet could go to Babylon, where Nebuzaradan promised to care for him, or remain in the land. He was free to go wherever he thought best. Jeremiah chose to remain with the people left in Judah. Nebuzaradan gave him provisions and a gift, then sent him to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, at Mizpah. The family that had once protected Jeremiah now received responsibility for the remnant. Nebuchadnezzar appointed Gedaliah governor over the towns of Judah and over the poor who had not been deported. Mizpah, north of ruined Jerusalem, became the center of this reduced community. Judean military leaders who had remained in the countryside heard of the appointment and came to Gedaliah. Among them were Johanan, son of Kareah, and Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, a man of royal descent. Gedaliah urged them not to fear serving the Babylonians. "Live in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well with you." He promised to represent them before Babylonian officials while they gathered wine, summer fruit, and oil, and settled in the towns they had occupied. Judeans who had fled to Moab, Ammon, Edom, and other regions began returning. They harvested an abundance. After the fire, life was beginning again in small and vulnerable forms. The remnant had land, crops, and a governor willing to accept Babylonian rule. The path Jeremiah had urged before Jerusalem fell remained open to those who survived it. Then Johanan came privately to Gedaliah with a warning. Baalis, king of the Ammonites, had sent Ishmael to assassinate him. Gedaliah did not believe it. Johanan offered to kill Ishmael secretly before the plot could destroy the community gathering at Mizpah. Gedaliah forbade him. "You are speaking falsely about Ishmael." In the 7th month, Ishmael arrived with 10 men. Gedaliah received them for a meal. During the meal, Ishmael and his companions rose and killed him. They also killed the Judeans and Babylonian soldiers with him at Mizpah. The assassination struck the fragile arrangement at its center. The governor appointed by Babylon was dead, murdered by a member of Judah's royal house. Ishmael then slaughtered pilgrims arriving in mourning and cast their bodies into a cistern. He took captive the king's daughters and the people Nebuzaradan had entrusted to Gedaliah and began moving toward Ammon. Johanan pursued him. The two groups met near the great pool at Gibeon. When the captives saw Johanan and his forces, they turned and joined them. Ishmael escaped with 8 men and reached the Ammonites, but his prisoners were recovered. Johanan had rescued the remnant, yet he feared Babylon's response to Gedaliah's murder. He led the people south and stopped near Bethlehem, intending to continue into Egypt. Before crossing the border, the commanders and people approached Jeremiah. "Let our plea come before you," they said. "Pray for us to the Lord your God, for all this remnant. Tell us where we should go and what we should do." They promised to obey whether the answer seemed favorable or unfavorable. Jeremiah agreed to pray. 10 days later, the word came. If they remained in Judah, they would be built and planted. They were not to fear the king of Babylon. God would show them mercy, and they would continue in their own land. But if they chose Egypt because they wanted a place without war, trumpet calls, or hunger, the dangers they feared would follow them there. Sword and famine would overtake them. Egypt would not be their refuge. Jeremiah then confronted the promise they had made. They had asked for direction, but they had not asked with a willingness to remain. Their hearts were already fixed upon Egypt. Azariah, Johanan, and the other proud men rejected the answer. "You are speaking falsely," they told Jeremiah. They accused Baruch of inciting him so that the Babylonians might kill or deport them. After watching every favorable prophecy concerning Jerusalem fail, the remnant now called Jeremiah false when his word blocked the escape they had chosen. They gathered the men, women, children, and king's daughters and crossed into Egypt. They also took Jeremiah and Baruch with them. At Tahpanhes, an Egyptian border city, Jeremiah performed another sign. He took large stones and buried them in the pavement at the entrance to Pharaoh's palace in sight of the Judeans. Nebuchadnezzar would come to Egypt, he announced, and set his throne over those stones. The empire they had crossed a border to escape would extend its power into the refuge they had selected. Egypt's temples and gods could not guarantee safety. The remnant spread through Egyptian settlements, including Migdol, Memphis, and the region of Pathros. There, Jeremiah confronted them over their continued worship of other gods. They had seen what such worship had done to Jerusalem. Judah's towns lay empty, and the temple was burned. Yet in Egypt they continued burning incense, bringing the same rebellion into the land where they hoped to survive. The people answered openly. "As for the word you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord, we will not listen to you." They insisted that they would continue making offerings to the Queen of Heaven. They claimed that when they had done so in Judah, they possessed food and prosperity, and that hardship followed when those offerings stopped. The women added that their husbands knew of the vows and offerings. Jeremiah answered that the very worship they remembered as a source of prosperity had been remembered in judgment. Judah's ruin stood as its consequence. The remnant had now confirmed its decision in words. They would keep their vows to the Queen of Heaven. Then they would learn which word endured, theirs or the Lord's. Only a small number would escape Egypt and return to Judah. As a sign, Jeremiah announced that Pharaoh Hophra would be handed to his enemies, just as Zedekiah had been handed to Nebuchadnezzar. Judah's last organized remnant had survived Babylon's conquest, the burning of Jerusalem, Gedaliah's assassination, and Ishmael's violence. It had asked Jeremiah for the way forward and promised obedience. Yet, when the answer required remaining in the devastated land under Babylonian rule, the people repeated the choice that had governed Jerusalem before its fall. Jeremiah's narrative ends among them in Egypt. The prophet called to uproot and plant had lived to see the city uprooted. He carried the word beyond its ruins, but no final scene records his return to Anathoth or his field. The account closes instead by counting deportations and returning once more to Babylon. 37 years after Jehoiachin had been taken from Jerusalem, a new Babylonian king, evil Merodach, came to the throne. In the year of his accession, he released Jehoiachin from prison. He spoke kindly to the captive king and gave him a seat above the other captive kings in Babylon. Jehoiachin exchanged his prison clothes for other garments and ate regularly at the royal table. An allowance was provided for him every day for the rest of his life. Jerusalem remained burned. David's throne had not been restored. Jeremiah's field still belonged to a future beyond the catastrophe. But the king, carried away as a condemned young man, was lifted from prison in old age. The final image is quiet, a surviving son of David, no longer wearing prison clothes, receiving bread each day at the table of Babylon.